Welcome everybody. So today we're going to do three papers that are related in different ways. We'll have an hour for each paper. We've asked the presenters to kind of keep the presentation under an hour, so we have some time at the end to talk as well. I think for the first paper, we've got Danial Lashkari talking about information technology and the returns to scale. So Daniel, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, George. And I should definitely start by thanking all the organizers for putting together this really nice program and also including us. This is joint paper with Jocelyn Boussard. Jocelyn is actually here today with us and is going to help me on the chats. If you have questions, he can also answer some clarification questions that way. Also, Arthur Bauer is our third co-author. He's based at CREST in Paris. Now, the motivation for this paper is to think about the extent to which the rise of information technology or IT could potentially have biases towards certain scales of production. Now, there's been 2 or 3 decades by now of empirical research showing that adoption of IT tools by firms has contributed to the rise in productivity, both at the micro and at the macro levels. But there are some suspicions that potentially there might have been some contribution from this in the trends for the evolution of industry concentration and also business dynamism. What we're going to do here is to use the context of France as a laboratory for thinking about this question. The reason is that we have, in France, we have access to fairly rich micro-level data on investments of firms in software and hardware for essentially the universe of all French firms. And basically, that's going to be the setting that we're going to study. Now, what I'm showing you here in this graph is the solid line shows you the fall in quality adjusted price of IT equipment in France, in the context of France, from 1990 to 2015. And the idea is that, as you'd expect, there's been a substantial fall in the effective price of IT for firms. In tandem, over the same period, firms have shifted their composition of their investments toward IT. The IT intensity of equipment capital in France has substantially risen. And you wouldn't be surprised perhaps to know that this pattern is happening all across the advanced economies. In all countries, the patterns are similar. Now, also in the context of France, if we look at the patterns of industry concentration, this is using our data, universe of French firms, 6 different proxies of industry concentration, averaged across 3-digit industries in France. There's a clear upward trend. And once again, this pattern is very similar to what other people have found in the US, in other OECD countries. Also recently in France, other papers have also replicated this result. So the question is, are there any links between these two? Is there any sense in which IT is particularly biased toward large firms? And if so, what are the implications for the distribution of the gains from IT, the productivity gains that IT have produced, between workers on the one hand and also owners of firms and capital on the other? So the natural question is, why should there be such a bias? And we're going to here basically give you one way of thinking about it. This is more of a motivation. We're not going to be basically going after such clear mechanisms. We're going to be basically thinking about documenting such a potential link. But in terms of what the potential mechanism is going to be, let's think about a number of different IT tools that have been used in a widespread fashion starting in the 1990s. These are the enterprise resource planning systems. What these tools do is that they essentially allow firms to coordinate and facilitate information flows between very different divisions, different types of tasks, from human resource management, supply chain management, manufacturing, customer relation management. Now, the point is that these types of coordination requirements are more relevant for larger firms that are doing more things, that are dealing with more problems. And therefore, from the perspective of a production function of the firm, one implication could be that the marginal product of IT would be higher for firms that operate at higher scales of production relative to other types of inputs. And that's going to be basically what's guiding us in the way we look at the data. So with that, let me give you an outline of the different components of the paper. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. How are you? Shouldn't you think of that also more generally in terms of finding suppliers, whether the task is done in-house or outside? IT is going to facilitate that communication and possibly that search. So you might see small firms that are producing complex goods. They're still linking tasks across its supply chain.
For sure. Once we get into the details, as you're mentioning, there are different ways in which this is going to basically also have implications for even outsourcing of activities of the firms outside the firm. But what this slide meant to do was to basically motivate in terms of just like at the level of the idea, why it could be that in principle there could be such a bias. What we'll do in practice, which is what I'm going to actually tell you right now, just in the next slide, is that we're just going to document that relationship. We're going to show you that IT intensity seems to be strongly correlated with size. And here I'm just giving you a way to think about why it could be. But once one starts to think about this mechanism in tills, perhaps exactly as you said, that there could be other related mechanisms that could also operate in tandem with this as well.
Right. The reason why I'm signing is that size we know is correlated with other things that are correlated with complexity, but they're not necessarily the same. So you could use to say some measure of complexity of goods or skill intensity, and that could also correlate. But so, wait until you get there.
Yeah. So in fact, yeah. So exactly. Let's talk about it when we get there. We do look at a number of different proxies of what we think of as complexity, like the number of products firms produce or the number of destinations. That's the direction we go, is in that way, which is to come up with eclectic measures of firm scale and show that the relations we're documenting, they hold in terms of the standard measures of size, but also they hold when we go to these more eclectic measures of size as well. Okay, so
let me just follow up on that just for a second, which is I interpreted part of that comment as being IT could be kind of rolled out. There's not like a big fixed cost to it if Amazon gives us all back office, services, or Paychex does that for us. And so what is it going to be that's not going to have these things just sold in the marketplace, and so that size doesn't really matter anymore?
So the story I'm giving you is not about the cost. It's about the use, the productivity of these tools. So the idea is that it's true that perhaps as a moms and pop store, I can, buy a system that sort of streamlines my finances. But regardless, that task itself was not that complex for me relative to other things I was doing to begin with. Whereas for a firm that is trying to scale up, that is trying to basically deal with, let's say, tens of thousands of workers, these types of organization problems are really more binding. And so the added value of some software package that allows them to handle their human resources or their financing, in the other example I gave, is going to be much more so for that large firms relative to a small firm.
Okay.
That would be basically the mechanism here. Okay, so now, as I said, there are three parts of the paper. The beginning is going to be just using the data to document our core fact. We have measures of flows of investments, as I mentioned. We construct measures of capital from them. And as just came up in the conversation we had a second ago with Cecilia, we have many different measures of firm scale. We construct many different proxies of IT intensity. And one robust thing that we find over and over again is that these two seem to be substantially significantly related within industry across firms, also within firm. And even we use exogenous sources of variation in size, IVs for size, and we find that there is a substantial elasticity of IT intensity on firm scale. Then, as I mentioned, one key goal for us is to look at the consequences of this for aggregate factor distribution of income. We also look at, in addition to concentration that we just looked at, we look at the implications for the evolution of labor share in the aggregate in France. We decompose it to within and across firm components, and we find similar patterns that recent literature in the context of the US has found. Within firm labor share is rising across firms. There is shifts of market shares toward low labor share firms. And I'm going to come back to this in a second as I describe the predictions of the theory. Now, second part of the paper is basically giving you a simple, very simple framework to rationalize this fact and also think about the consequences for the aggregate economy. Here, the core of it is going to be a non-homothetic production function. As I just said, we do find an elasticity of IT intensity on firm size that leads us to think that IT factor demand is non-homothetic, and that's going to be basically the only tweak that we do to an otherwise standard model. Now, what we find is that this is going to actually create some additional forces, unleash some new forces in the model, which comes down to the fact that the returns to scale in a model like this has to be endogenous. And it does vary in response to changes in factor prices, and in particular, the fall in the price of IT. So just to preview, one of the channels that, one of the kinds of effects that is going to be present in this model is that when I reduce the price of IT, returns to scale at the firm level is going to rise. As firms adopt IT, returns to scale rises. And because of this, I'm going to show you, one can very simply show that labor share within firm is going to rise. That's going to be in line with the exact same result that I mentioned a second ago we find in France. Now, across firms, because of the bias toward large firms, because larger firms are spending more on IT, the price of IT falls, there is a shift of economic activity toward large firms, concentration rises, but these large firms are going to, as I'll show you in a little bit, have a lower labor share, and therefore this is going to have an adverse impact on the aggregate labor share. This is once again going to be in line with what we find in the data. The last part of the paper is going to be bringing this model to the data. We estimate the parameters of the non-homothetic production function using techniques from production function estimation literature, and we find that once we calibrate the model around these parameters, we shock it with the observed fall in the price of IT, the same numbers that I showed you in the previous slide, and we can explain half of the observed rise in industry concentration, as well as the components of labor share in the aggregate using this one shock in the context of France. So there's a whole lot of work. Of course, papers that we see today are going to be looking at a number of other consequences of IT, but this is obviously a much broader literature on the IT side. And of course, there is a strong link with the literature that has been recently documenting a number of secular macroeconomic trends. And recent papers have also looked at the consequences of IT from different angles on these trends as well. So let me now move on to the first part of the paper, the data and our key facts. So there are different sources of data we use. We use one survey of firms to find measures of investments in software. This is comprehensive for all firms above 20 employees, with above 20 employees, and a representative sample for smaller firms. For the hardware, we rely on the BRN data, which is based on administrative tax records of firms, and it's comprehensive for firms, roughly speaking, with above 500,000 euros in revenues. So there's a component of investment in this data that essentially captures hardware. It does include office furniture as well. For some reason, this was close enough for the people who created the classification at the time. It's not the ideal measure. It's not like our software measure that only measures software. We're going to rely on this as our proxy for hardware. We also append to our data a much larger administrative level data for smaller firms to account for the patterns of concentration and labor share as well. For these smaller, very small firms, we don't actually observe their hardware, but we use them for some of the other aggregate facts that we are documenting. I just mentioned that We also use some other eclectic measures of size. For those, we have to rely on other data sets. Again, for the purpose of this talk, I don't think we would have the time. I would have the time to go into them. And I also mentioned already that we used a perpetual inventory method to construct stock measures out of the flow investments that we are observing for software and hardware. We do this also for all the other components of capital as well, to construct measures of total capital stock of the firm.
Daniel, when I see that you're using customs data only as a measure of complexity, but I would think that there's an opportunity there to measure shocks to the supply of these IT goods, since they're mostly produced in other countries.
Thank you for bringing that up. I had to point out that, in fact, we do use it not for actually supply of IT goods, but we use that to construct measures of basically outputs, supply shocks to the firm itself. So for the sample of exporting firms, we rely on this data to essentially construct an IV for firm size in line with a number of other papers in the literature. And I had to mention that and I forgot. So thank you for bringing that up. But you're right that we can also use it for the importing firms as well. And so far that we haven't done that. Yes, that is another way to leverage the customs level data. Okay, so
can I ask another measurement question? So like George was mentioning, like you hire paychecks to take care of my stuff. Where does that doesn't show up anywhere here, right? Or
so you're hiring
you hire what's that company, Paychecks or Salesforce or something like that?
ADP, a payroll processing company.
Yeah, you hire those guys to take care of your back end stuff.
So you're saying that you're outsourcing is,
yeah.
Yes, that doesn't show up. So so when you look at the software data, it actually gives you a decomposition of the different components of what constitutes the software investment. So there is spending on creation of software in-house. If you pay a software engineer in-house to construct it, to write software, that is included. If you pay for maintenance and maintenance of the software, that's also included. And if you also pay to buy the software from outside, those are the three components. Now, what you have in mind, if it's basically essentially outsourcing some kind of IT services, I believe it's not, unless if Jocelyn has some, my understanding is that that shouldn't be there. But one thing that I had to emphasize is that this is the period we're looking at is 1995 to 2007. So some of the more recent waves of, let's say, cloud computing and other things is not going to be relevant to this context. Does that?
Just a small comment is that I'm not sure if you want paychecks to be there, in the sense that that's much more about the navigating the complexity of the labor laws than about IT per se, no?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question, and to be honest,
that can be a discussion for later.
Yeah, exactly. Let's come back to this. If you're more interested, we can chat more about what should be there. So, but at least I can tell you what is there already. And one thing that was more of a concern for us was to make sure that at least in-house investments, even if it's in the firm, the form of paying workers, software engineers in-house to make it to be there, and that is there.
Yeah,
Okay,
I guess the question is it like the correlation you're going to show right here, is this really about keeping it within the firm or like outsourcing? That's kind of the thing that I'm worried about, is that it's not per se about IT, it's just about a choice of the nature of the structure of the firm, what I'm going to do inside or outside.
Right, but so I think that's a good point. And so that you could basically think of a particular way in which small firms would be in some way indirectly spending on IT without that showing out in our data. And that should be a concern. So far, we haven't really thought of a clean way to exactly see that potential for that, but for sure, let's talk about what examples you have in mind. We did talk to accountants in the French census bureau, it's called INSEE for them, and discuss like what are the potential ways that this measure could be imperfect. But we weren't thinking of any particular dimension like that, but perhaps there could be something that we can discuss. One thing that actually is encouraging to us is that whatever it is, it has to show up both for the software and hardware. These are two different measures. And in fact, we have also separately, I'm not showing any of those results today, we've also showed at particular occupational codes that involve working with IT, and these results also shows up there as well. But once again, you might be able to come up with stories that would basically encompass all those three. But for now, we are going to take these as our understanding of what expenditure on software or investment in software means. Okay, so let me show you a number of results like this, where I construct some measure of IT intensity. I put it on the left-hand side. In the context of this slide, it's going to be IT investment or stock per worker. On the right-hand side, I'm going to have 4-digit industry time fixed effects, cohort fixed effects, and then a bin of size in employment terms fixed effect. Now, if you look at the figure to the left, this is for the case of software investment and stock, moving from 0 to 5 employees, that's the number that is basically normalized, everything is compared to that, to firms more than 5,000 employees, there's a gradual increase in software investment and stock per worker. Figure to the right shows the same thing for hardware. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to look at this for different proxies of IT intensity. For instance, you might think that, oh, there's something about maybe financial constraints that could be driving the previous slide. Here, I'm going to divide IT investment to total IT investment, or IT stock to total capital stock.
Daniel, what do these numbers mean? Like on the previous one, you said there's like 1,500?
Yes, this is 100. So this is going to be, so in this case, it's going to be 100 euros per worker. So for
okay.
Look at the investment going from 0 to 5 employees to plus 5,000 employees.
So if I thought about like a capital share, right, which we agree is say like a third, how is this going to move us from like 0.31 for the small firms to 0.35, or is it moving us like by more than that? Just
so I thought about it in those terms, but I can tell you that relative to the average investment per worker, these are huge numbers.
Yeah, they seem huge. That's why I'm trying to understand, like,
the average is basic. This is like 3-4 times the average investment per worker that we are basically seeing this movement. So it's not that we're talking about small deviations around an average.
Does that mean the big firms have 70% capital intensity and the small firms have 0? Or, I mean, I think that's kind of, that would have been an easier way to kind of understand these graphs.
So you're saying that you want to, so let's maybe
the capital share of output, right?
This might be actually more helpful in that way. So this is basically telling us the ratio of IT capital to total capital. And IT capital is always for these firms a very, very small. So these numbers are, I believe, 30 euros per 1,000 euros. So for every 1,000 euros of total capital, you see when you're going from 0 to 5 employees to more than 5,000 employees, you're basically increasing about the relative investment in IT stocks by 30 euros relative to for every 1,000 euros of total capital stock. Now, what you're saying is you want to compare the capital share to total revenues of the firm, right? That's what you have in mind?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of understand how big the differences were. And I guess just having like the dollars differences, it was hard to kind of figure out whether these were really big differences or little differences. But if you're saying the biggest firms have $30 more than the smallest firms, that seems tiny.
Really, but you have to compare it to the average investment in software, right? So the software intensity is overall very small. Then the aggregate software intensity is going to be about 3 or 4%.
Yeah, it just you know, I guess these guys are getting amazing returns on that small investment, which makes me wonder why they didn't do a lot more of it before.
We haven't seen anything about the returns yet, as of yet.
But I mean, you know, the way you sort of talked about it, that's why we're having these giant increases in concentrations, because they're kind of having a little bit more of this extra capital sitting around. It makes it seem like they must have giant returns, but maybe you'll back it out through the model.
Right. So at the end, everything we're going to do is going to come down to the accounting that happens within the structure of the model. And I'll show you how large the effects at the end are going to be. So let's just wait a little bit, a couple of slides from here, it might become, so these numbers are in just like a way, as you said, in levels. We're going to later on shift to thinking everything in terms of elasticities, which might be a little bit more helpful in terms of getting a sense of the magnitudes. So this is the final one. So this is the IT intensity of costs, essentially dividing investments and stock by the total of labor wage bill as well as the capital expenditure or capital factor payments. And once again, you find this positive relationship. One other thing we can do here is, and this is what I was talking about a second ago, is to use a different proxy for size. So far I showed you proxy for size in employment terms. I can use proxy size by sales or by value added. And what these coefficients are showing you are, let's start from the first one. This is basically the same exercise I showed you before, except that I'm doing a regression of log IT intensity on log firm size. And the coefficients are hovering between 0.3, 0.4. This is for software, intensity of labor, capital cost, the same three graphs I showed you. This is for hardware. Next thing is that I can do this within firm, meaning I'm adding a firm fixed effect. And the results are fairly robust to this. So this is not, this relationship, not only it holds in the cross section, but it holds within firm as well. And this last one is coming from the exercise I mentioned in the discussion with Cecilia, where we use for the sample of exporting firms, we have these export demand shocks that are basically the standard shift share instruments that is widely used in the literature, that allows us to have an exogenous source of variation in firm size. And the coefficients are much larger. This is partly because of a different sample. This is the sample of exporting firms, but this is also identifying for us the elasticity of IT intensity on firm size. And once again, in all of the cases, the numbers are significant. Okay, so there's more to these results. There are a battery of robustness that checks on this we do in the paper, but let me move on from these core facts, add one additional fact about labor share, and then move on to the theory.
Daniel, can I just didn't get the last slide in one sense. Are these cost shares? So these are elasticity. When you say labor intensity, capital intensity, are those cost shares?
So labor intensity of labor is exactly the first figure I showed you. It's basically stock.
So euros per.
Yes, exactly. Euros of capital stock divided by the number of workers. Log of that on log of firm size.
Okay.
Second one is going to be the same thing for capital, dividing it by capital. The third one is going to be dividing it by the sum of both.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so this is basically the same exercise as we did with IT intensity. On the left-hand side here, I'm instead using labor share of the firm. And I guess in some sense it's also going to be reassuring that not everything like this we do ends up giving us a positive slope. In this case, we find a negative slope, meaning larger firms have lower labor shares in line with what David Otter and co-authors in their paper Superstar Firms have found in the context of the US. One final exercise, as I promised, we want to think about the implications for factor distribution of income, is to look at the aggregate labor share in France over this period. We want to think about the extent to which all of the channels that we are after potentially could contribute the evolution of aggregate labor share. The aggregate labor share in France is fairly stable from 1990 to 2007. What is interesting is that very much like what, again, David Otter and others have found in the US, if I do a decomposition of this aggregate labor share to within firm versus across firms, the dashed red line is telling you if I keep the share of weights in market constant, how much does the distribution of labor share shift upward or downward? In fact, it shifts upward, meaning within firm labor share is on the rise. What does the dashed blue line show you? It shows you that constantly market shares have been getting reallocated toward low labor share firms. And it just so happens that the two have canceled out. So the aggregate is constant, but there's a deviation on within and across firm contributions to labor share. Okay, so with this, let me move on to the theory part of the paper. So what I'm going to do is that, as I mentioned, the core is going to be this production function that lines up with the non-homotheticity and IT factor demands that we've done. This slide is in line with the second slide, is sort of a motivational slide, meaning that I'm going to construct this slide, this production function, in such a way that lines up with the intuitions that I gave you. There's going to be a nested structure. Y output is an aggregate of F of Xn, which is the bundle of non-IT inputs, Cobb-Douglas of K and L, alpha being the intensity of capital, and L is labor. And Xi, what is Xi? Xi is the bundle of IT inputs. It's again, Cobb-Douglas of software S, hardware H, and the intensity of software is beta. Now the core is this function F, and I'm going to construct it by saying y to the power of gamma is a CS aggregate of the bundle of non-IT inputs, but the firm has to combine that with what we call organizational input O. It's a CS, elasticity of substitution is sigma, and there's this gamma here. This gamma is basically just shifting returns to scale up or down. Now, the organizational input, this is where this story of organization and relationship with the scale comes into the picture. We're going to assume that in principle, it could fall with size, with some elasticity minus epsilon. And then IT is exactly the kind of inputs that firms can adopt to basically respond to the fact that their organizational inputs are going down. Now, this is just a motivation. What it gives us in practice is that once I solve for the factor demand for this production function, if I think of W as the relative price of IT, let's take the price of the bundle of non-IT inputs to be the numeraire. W is the relative price of IT. The share of factor payments to IT to non-IT is going to have the W term that we are familiar with from CS, but now there's going to be Y to the power of epsilon here, meaning that this intensity is going to have a constant elasticity in size, the elasticity being epsilon times 1 minus sigma.
Daniel, these big firms are more capital intensive, and I guess given what you've said about IT, they're probably more capital intensive in the traditional sense of capital, which you've got as K over L here. So would it be straightforward to extend this setup so that you could have the physical capital have this sort of similar feature where the big firms are more capital intensive?
So absolutely, one can basically, so here, I'm basically assuming this Cobb-Douglas structure in a way to sort of not get into more complex forms of aggregators, but exactly as you said, one can include a CS aggregator first of all, account for that heterogeneity that we don't account for here because the capital and labor here are going to have constant intensities. And then if you believe that perhaps you can think of that relationship also in non-homotheticity terms, yes, exactly. We can basically incorporate that as yet another aggregator that is non-homothetic here.
I guess that raises the question of what kinds of software. There's some interaction between physical robots are physical capital. The more I'm automating stuff, the more it's going to be software controlled. This production function, I think, points to certain types of software in terms of how it interacts with capital and labor, right? What is the sort of ideal, or what types of software do you have in mind?
And that's why I'm using this motivation for organization. So what I think of here are the types of software that are basically about the organizational aspects of production. Like the examples I gave you was a product like the enterprise resource planning. You can think of other related things like the supply chain management tools or customer relation management tools. They're not basically the capital that goes here is really the machine that produces the output that you're selling. But if you're doing different tasks within the firm, I'm thinking about the IT that goes into that. So it's very different from, I want you to think of it very differently than the robots and the consequences of robots, because robots perform one task. These types of tools allow firms to do different tasks all at once. So that's a really good question in that terms of clarifying what type of inputs really we're talking about here. Okay, so this is just
I won't ask a really good question, but you made a decision to use a value-added production function, and often we will kind of have a gross output production function. where we have materials in there, and this kind of goes back to the early discussion about like, services that you rent. So can you kind of just speak to like why you didn't take that approach where, there you can sort of map the firm a little bit better into the inputs that they're using? For instance, one of the things I know is that, you keep talking about supply chain management. There's a proxy for how good you are at supply chain management, which is the inventory sales ratio. And so are there things by having like a more disaggregated production function, we can actually speak to the mechanisms that you're thinking about?
The honest answer is that simplicity. I agree with you that my ideal setting would be to include the intermediate inputs as well. So I have a gross production function, and even in line with the discussion we had a second ago, even include potentially more dimensions of non-homotheticity in addition to IT. But the goal of this paper, the way we saw it, was to try to basically delineate, isolate the forces that are going to be in operation. And there was basically a trade-off we had in how complex, how many forces we could bring in while being able to still communicate the core insights. But I agree with you that in some ways, and that's one of them, the setup could definitely be become more realistic than what we have.
I guess I was thinking those other things can be pretty well measured in the data as well, and could actually speak to the way the firms are changing with size.
Absolutely. The French data is awesome in that it basically tells you whatever you want to see. So our shortage, I can't use the excuse of not having the data, unfortunately. I do have all the data to look at anything that you guys want to look at, but in this case, it's really the limitation of our, I guess on the one hand, like computational perhaps problems, as you'll see, we have to estimate the production function. There are many other issues related to that, but also in terms of just being able to communicate what is it that is driving the results. But perhaps the next step, next step could be to start bringing in that, because it allows us to also think about outsourcing in a more systematic and model in some sense more rigorous ways. But let's look at actually what we are doing here, which is that, okay, this is just the same production function. When we embed it in the model, we introduce heterogeneity in productivity. We do it along 2 dimensions. The first one is e to the power of theta, which is factor symmetric, gets multiplied by both factors, non-IT and IT. We do have to include some IT augmenting productivity, e to the power of phi. And that's because it's going to become a confound in some sense for us. So we have to allow for that source of variation. So again, by now it should be clear, if epsilon is 0, you're going to get exactly the standard CS production function. The rest of it is also very standard. We assume basically CS demand with elasticity lambda. You have some entry cost chi in units of non-IT inputs. You enter, you draw theta and phi. There is an evolution, Markov evolution on productivities. You have some fixed costs, again, in units of non-IT inputs, endogenous exit, as well as exogenous death shock. So there's nothing other than this epsilon difference from our standard framework. Okay, so let's look at the key properties of the production function. I think I won't have the time to show you the aggregation results, but at least I want to make sure that we get to the core results in partial equilibrium so you can see actually the mechanism and in its all clarity. So the assumption we make is that factor markets are frictionless in inelastic exogenous factor supply. So in some sense, down the road, when I reduce the price of IT, that's because these factor supplies exogenously are rising. It's very reduced form in that way. But out of cost minimization, so I can solve cost minimization in this context, and the cost share of IT, omega, which is the share of factor payments to IT divided by all variable costs, that's going to be our index, theory relevant index of IT intensity. And what that is going to be dependent on this effective cost price of IT. So W is the price of IT. As usual, once I bring in IT augmenting productivity, e to the power of minus phi is going to get multiplied to that. Now, in presence of non-homotheticity, the effective price also gets affected by the size of the firm with an elasticity epsilon. So what is the marginal cost? So this expression should be familiar to us. The numerator is just because we don't have constant returns to scale. It's basically this gamma, which is basically going to be deviating from 1 in principle. The term in the denominator, that's the effective productivity, marginal productivity of the firm. E to the power of theta is the usual factor symmetric productivity. Z is accounting for the contribution of IT to marginal productivity. And it's an index that might look a bit ugly, but what I want to bring your attention to is that this also is only a function of the relative effective price of IT, e to the power of minus phi, W, y to the power of epsilon. So this Z is going to be capturing what we care about in productivity terms for the firm. And this is perhaps the most important theoretical slide we have, which is to link basically this non-homotheticity patterns to returns to scale. Let's focus on the output elasticity of cost as our index of returns to scale. This is essentially marginal divided by average products. Marginal divided by average costs. The higher this is, the lower the returns to scale. The nice thing about our specification is that this object becomes a linear function of IT intensity, and the slope is exactly epsilon. If epsilon is 0, as you'd expect, this object is exogenous. The returns to scale is basically exactly given by that parameter gamma that I put on the left-hand side as a power of y. Once I allow for non-homotheticity, when IT intensity is higher, it's indicative of higher cost elasticity, lower returns to scale. And remember, this is a cost minimization result. This is an optimal solution. It means that these firms were dealing with organizational issues. That's why they've adopted a lot of IT, because the prices that they were facing were the same. Why is this important? This is important because when I think about the factor distribution of income, the revenue to cost ratio, what is that? Markup times marginal cost times output. This is revenue divided by cost. This term is exactly the cost elasticity. It's linear in cost elasticity. Yes, markup is there. Some recent papers have looked at a lot of the same forces that the same trends that we are looking at today through the lens of variations in markups within firm, across firms, and response of that to other shocks. For us, this is constant. All of the variations in profits to cost is driven by variations in returns to scale. And this is not going to involve any distortions. Okay, so what does that imply for the labor share? It implies that out of every dollar that I earn as a firm, 1 over this ratio is going to all of my factors. Out of that, 1 minus omega is going to go to non-IT inputs. And out of that, the constant share 1 minus alpha is going to go to labor. So our focus is going to be the extent to which changes in factor prices are going to shift the composition of income between profits and factor payments. Our favorable set of parameters, which are going to be in line with what we find in the data, in our estimation is going to be when IT and non-IT are gross complements, epsilon is positive. In this case, when size goes up, IT intensity goes up. IT intensity goes up from the first equation, cost elasticity goes up. Therefore, profit share is higher and labor share is lower. This is a cross-sectional result that lines up with the cross-sectional results I show you, what we found in the data as well. And one thing I have to say is that this result is much more general than the context of non-homothetic C. Yes, we generalize into the paper if you're interested. It's not only a byproduct of this particular function form. When we have non-homotheticity with some mild conditions, we can then show that this has to be the case, that larger firms would have lower levels of returns to scale. So what does this all mean for the response of the economy to a fall in the price of IT? Once again, here I'm doing a partial equilibrium analysis. Let's think about the pass-through to marginal cost of firms. The pass-through to marginal cost of the firm is going to be the elasticity of marginal cost to the price of IT. It's going to be the path through to average cost, that's omega, IT intensity. If your IT intensity is higher, it means that you're spending more on IT, so the path through is going to be higher to you. In addition, the path through to cost elasticity is going to show up, because remember that marginal cost is cost elasticity time average cost. What is this? We can compute this exact non-homothetic that this elasticity of IT intensity to size shows up. It's positive. It means that when the price of IT goes up, cost elasticity goes up, meaning that returns to scale and IT intensity have the relationship that I mentioned earlier, that when the price of IT falls, therefore returns to scale at the firm level goes up. And this result is very general. This is basically going to be always holding whenever I have non-homotheticity, regardless of what functional form you're going to take. So all in all, when the price of IT falls within firm, because of this effect on cost elasticity, price falls, cost elasticity goes down, profit share goes down, labor share goes down within the firm. Because this pass-through is larger for large firms. Remember that larger firms have higher IT cost shares, right? So the pass-through is larger for large firms, therefore concentration goes up. But in the previous slide, I showed you that larger firms have lower labor shares. When concentration goes up, this labor share is going to go down. And in the paper, again, because of the time constraints, I'm not going to go through the entire exercise of aggregating this. The nice thing is that this linearity that we have here allows us to simplify the aggregation very much. And we can basically derive analytical expressions, particularly for this last exercise of showing you when in the aggregate the price changes, there's an aggregate elasticity of substitution. I can exactly decompose that to the contribution within firm and across firm, and then show you exactly the contribution of non-homotheticity to that. But let's skip this. If you're interested, we can maybe at the end have discussions about it or offline. Let me move on to the empirical part of the paper, where we bring this model essentially to the data. Or let me just pause for a second if you have some questions, because this might have been fairly quick. So let me pause for a second if you have any questions. Okay, if not, let's move on to the empirical part. I mentioned earlier, we do this in 2 steps. First, we estimate the production function at the micro level, and then we go and do a calibration exercise around that, and then shock the model with the observed fall in the price of IT. So for the estimation, we pretty much follow the playbook of production function estimation, which is what we start by writing some firm outcome, obviously usually log of firm output, as a combination of a production function that includes some firm decisions D and some parameters. Usually there is some residual, and this residual is usually productivity. And the problem that we face is that productivity is typically correlated with firm decisions. So I can't just use decisions, contemporaneous decisions, as an instrument and basically estimate pi. So most production function estimation strategies rely on a dynamic panel idea, which is to impose some Markov structure on theta, saying that theta today is some function of theta yesterday and some innovation shock. And the key identification assumption typically is that firms yesterday, when they were making their production decisions, they didn't know this innovation shock. They know this part, they don't know this part. And that allows me to write moment conditions that basically relies on the orthogonality of this innovation shock on past firm decisions. So let's try to follow this very playbook. I'm going to write the log output as a function of firm decisions and then factor symmetric productivity. So this looks like what we saw before. The only problem is that unobserved IT augmenting productivity shows up here in a very nonlinear way, interacting with everything else. So I'm going to use a trick that Doralski and Jalmandro have also recently used in the standard CS context, and that is to rely on the first order conditions for the 2 flexible inputs. We're going to assume that labor and software are flexible, hardware and capital we allow for adjustment costs. I can derive then log of software to labor ratio as a function of relative prices, observables, and then IT augmenting productivity. Now this looks exactly log linear, very much like this expression that we saw before. And what that allows me to do is...
Daniel, is IT associated with firm growth? I'm just concerned that IT sometimes may be used in innovation and increasing productivity per se.
That's a good point. So you're saying that, so let me just go to the next slide and then I'll come back to this point. I think I see what you're getting at, and it's a good point. But I know
the
where
assumption of the Markov productivity process.
Exactly. So it's going to basically you're saying that it has to show up in the Markov process itself. And I think there might be ways of incorporating that in the framework as well. But just to link this to the previous slide, I can basically write a vector of firm outcomes, including log of output and log software to log labor ratio. And then the residual is going to become also a vector, factor symmetric productivity and IT augmented productivity. Everything else remains exactly like what we saw before. So once I have this transformation into a two-dimensional version of the same idea, I can assume the same kind of Markov process. Now, saying that theta and phi today depend on theta and phi yesterday, I allow even for some trends in productivity. I think this was actually one, when I presented this, George suggested this, and we actually followed your suggestion, George, and now we have this trend as well. But the trend actually ends up being next to zero. So, but it's important to account for it, because it's reasonable to assume that there have been trends in productivity in IT, at least. And then this additional innovation shock. And I think the point that Cecilia was making was that this process itself, IT could play a role in it. And it's true that for now, we are not accounting for that.
Daniel, can I take it back to the previous slide? I think I missed something. You assume here that software was a flexible input, but when you were showing us the data, you had investment in stock of software, which made it seem more like a state variable that you carry. So
yeah, that's a really good point. So there are two reasons that we do this. So stock, because we think that it acts like capital in some sense. It doesn't fully depreciate, essentially. But it depreciates very fast. It has the highest rate of depreciation that when we construct the measures of capital, the average rate of depreciation for software is about 30%. And what that means is that if you want to basically disinvest, it's very likely you can do that without investing. And that's different from other types of capital that have lower rates of depreciation. And if the resale is very hard, then you might be stuck with your current level of capital and you can disinvest. So in some sense, it is a form of capital. We think it is a form of capital in that it doesn't fully depreciate, but at the same time, first of all, the size of the investments are typically very small relative to other kinds of capital. So we don't think that the stories of financial frictions might be as relevant in this case, creating distortions to the optimal choice of software. And in addition, the fast rates of depreciation, we think, makes it more like a flexible input.
I get maybe I'm not familiar with this ERP stuff very much. If it was, software as a service in the current era with a subscription format where you could ditch it, I'm using Salesforce this year, I don't use it next year, I sort of understand it. Your answer to previous questions made it sound like this was more, I bought stuff once-off costs, and if I bought the software last year, is it like zero marginal cost next year? Or? So
if I bought it last year, let's think about what is it that prevents us? So actually, I think if you don't mind, I'm just looking at the time, and I think sure. It might be something that, because I realized that once I engage with it, I might actually have to talk for a little, because this is a really good question. It's come up and we've had discussions about it. So let's definitely follow up with this. And I agree that it's not as straightforward as let's say some other flexible inputs. But with this, let me just jump at showing you the estimates. We have like 5 or 6 more minutes, so I'm gonna try to sort of jump at the key points in the results. The main thing to of course pay attention to here is the estimates for Epsilon. We have the sample of all industries, only manufacturing. We also do this at the level of each industry, and the results are going to be very similar. The point is that in both cases, we find estimates around 0.4, highly significant. What about the elasticity of substitution between IT and non-IT? We find it to be very low, about 0.2, even lower than the typical standard estimates for capital and labor. And then one thing that I want you to pay attention to is that we also do this exact same exercise with CES, homothetic CES as well, and that's going to become handy for us later, because everything we do, we're going to do it in parallel for CES as well to be able to create a comparison. What about the cost elasticity? We find a number that is less than 1, which, if you remember, this is basically a reciprocal of the returns to scale elasticity. This means that the smallest firms in the industry that have essentially zero IT intensity, they're operating under increasing returns to scale. As firms increase their IT intensity, they're going to shift their cost elasticity from gamma to gamma plus epsilon, meaning that their IT intensity falls. So the range of IT returns to scales that we actually are seeing according to our theory is going to be something between 1.07 to 0.7. If you do CES or if you do Cobb-Douglas, you're going to find a constant number that masks all of that heterogeneity. And that heterogeneity, I want to emphasize, is going to be the core of what we do in this paper, is now in the cross-section of firms and also within firm, we have heterogeneity in returns to scale. So of course, because the numbers are hovering between 1.707 and 0.7, the average is in fact something like what we find if we don't allow for that heterogeneity. So we do the calibration. Let me skip the details. This is basically going to be what comes out of our calibration. If I look at the relationship between here left IT intensity and firm size, and the right labor share and firm size. And as I mentioned, every time I'm going to compare our results, our CS, that's the red one, with the plain vanilla CS, estimated exactly in the same fashion as ours. So the relationship between IT intensity and size is very strong in our case because of non-homotheticity. If anything, it's a little bit negative in the case of CES. Labor share, there is some negative relationship here. That's because of the fixed cost that is incorporated here, but this relationship is much stronger for us. And then the final exercise.
Magnitude with the data. I don't mean to take too much time, but if you put the data there, they
yes, the coefficient is virtually the same points. Okay. So if I basically run exactly the same regression that we do in the data, the coefficient is basically the same. So the last exercise, which was what I promised from the beginning, is to bring down the price of IT exactly by what we observe in data, which is by around 63%. So first, let's look at what happens at the firm level. What I'm showing you here, remember that essentially the IT cost share is a sufficient statistic. We have two dimensions of heterogeneity, but the IT cost share of the firm is sufficient for me to know its response to the fall in the price of IT. So what is the path through to marginal productivity? Because of this non-homotheticity, it becomes stronger. This is driven by, as I mentioned, the path through exactly to the cost elasticity. Remember, the marginal product cost is cost elasticity times average cost. Cost elasticity is obviously exogenous constant in CS, the blue line. In the context of non-homothetic CS, when price of IT falls, cost elasticity falls. This means that returns to scale increases, and that results in a stronger response in the path through to marginal productivity. What are the consequences for output? These are the equations that I didn't show you, the general equilibrium response of firm output. So you see the reallocations do happen under the case of homothetic CES, but they become stronger under non-homothetic CES. And what about the response of labor share? The response of labor share becomes stronger under non-homothetic CES. So how do these things translate into numbers in the aggregate that we care about? I hope that, I don't know if this is exactly the kind of numbers that George had in mind in early on, but this is basically a way to summarize what all of these mean for the aggregates. So I'm shocking the model exactly in the same, with the same fall in the price of IT. I'm looking at two indices of concentration that are meaningful in our context. The share of top 1%, 5% of firms in sales. In the data, I observe 0.8, 0.6 increase in these two measures. In the non-homothetic case, I find almost half of it, roughly speaking. And if you look at CES, that gives us half of what we have. So essentially, we magnify the results from a CS benchmark by a factor of 2. We don't get all the way to the data. Roughly, again, we are explaining half of the data. What about the contribution to aggregate labor share? Remember that within firm, there is increase by about 4%. Across firms, there is decrease by 4%. Again, we get half of it. the response in CS is more asymmetric. And finally, I mentioned this, we didn't talk about it in the slides, but it's in the paper. If you are interested in the consequences for aggregate elasticity of substitution, there's a sizable distinction between the two. And the bottom line, interestingly enough, is that non-homothetic CS in the aggregate looks very much like a Cobb-Douglas. That's not the case for the CES. So let me wrap up as I'm exactly out of time. So I showed you a framework that allows us to explain the micro relationship covariance between IT intensity and firm size that we find in the firm level data in France. We uncover non-homotheticity as the driver of this covariance, as well as the complementarity between IT and non-IT inputs. And I showed you that if we account for the endogeneity of returns to scale at the firm level, we can, that takes us a longer way in explaining the trends in concentration and labor share as a result of, in response to a fall in price of IT. And I'm sorry if I didn't leave a whole lot of time here for us, but we did have some discussions, and I hope that we get to discuss some of the other points that came up later.
Yep. Daniel, this was great, thanks. And it seemed familiar to me. I know I had seen it before. I was just kidding.
You have seen it, and you have
no,
made
I know.
You have made a mark on it.
Made a mark on it.
Sure.
Good. Thanks so much. So why don't, if someone has like one kind of like really brilliant comment wants to put to Daniel, we could go with that. I know that's kind of a high threshold, sort of a test to see how confident people are. So I know Mike is sort of thinking about it. So we could just take like a minute break if anyone wants to, or anything like that. Or otherwise we can kind of go to the next paper. No one wants to jump in. I know that was a challenge, wasn't it? All right. So who did we have second? Nicolas, you were going to talk second. Is that right?
Yes.
Perfect.
Should I already share my screen?
Let me just say, we will have time at the very end to kind of chat some more, obviously. So sorry, Nicolas, take it away.
All right, good, great. All right, can you see my screen well?
Perfect, yes.
All right.
It's great.
Okay, great. So thanks to the organizers for inviting us and for putting the program together. And this is joint work with Gaurav Khanna that he's in the chat, but also feel free to interrupt throughout the presentation as well. And I also posted the slides in the chat in case people are curious and want to go back and forth. And just before we start, the usual disclaimer that I need to give that these are our views and not the Richmond Fed or the Board of Governors. So the context of this paper is on the debate on high-skill immigration. We heard particularly the past 4 years, there's been a lot of debate on immigration in general, and also on high-skill immigration. And generally, these conversations, detractors of high-skill immigration argue that immigrants compete with a certain group of workers in the labor market that are close substitutes to the immigrants, and they have the potential to depress the wages and reduce employment. But at the same time, with high-skill immigration, we know that immigrants bring new skills and are potentially innovators, so they might also push the production frontier of a country that is receiving the immigrants. At the same time, there's another discussion, thinking more about the sending countries, that it argues that for high-skill immigration to developed countries, developing countries might suffer from brain drain, which is the most skilled people are leaving, and the developing country that's sending the immigrants has a lower skilled workforce. So if we look at the US, the main channel through which high-skilled immigrants get into the country is the H1b program. Now, basically, for the H1b program, is focused on college graduates, and it's employer-sponsored. So you need a firm to select the immigrant and sponsor them to come to the US. And the key characteristics that this program has related to policy is that first, the visas are capped. The value of the cap changed throughout the years, but there's a strict number for the private sector. And if the number of applications exceed the cap, many of the years, the visas go to a lottery, and the outcome gets determined. Who comes to the US gets determined through a lottery among all applicants. if we look at then who's coming through the H1B, we see that most of these workers that are coming are computer scientists that are from India and then work in the IT sector. So what we want to do in this paper is think about, given that it's so specific, the skill of computer science, and the country of India as a sending country for college graduates to the US, we want to think about the possibility that migration doesn't really create a brain drain, but it could be actually a motivation for, in this case, Indian students to acquire computer science skills. And many of them will end up staying in India, helping develop, for example, the IT sector in India. And in this case, what India, instead of experiencing a brain drain, will be experiencing what we call a brain gain. They will be gaining a valuable skill that then helps improve their productivity. And if we think about this concept of brain gain, this might change the predictions that an immigration model could have, for example, on where production is located. Because immigrants go to the US, that motivates more people to study computer science and stay in India, then IT actually might end up shifting partially to India as a response to US immigration policy. So with that in mind, what we do in this paper is first, I'm going to just present some descriptive evidence just to tell a little bit the story that happened since the 1990s and why do we think this is an important mechanism. We're going to provide some empirical evidence. And the idea we want to show here is we want to understand if there's some support in the data for this mechanism of when migration prospects increase, do we actually see a response in terms of occupations or human capital in India? And then with these facts in mind, we're going to set up a model. The model is going to have two main moving parts. There's going to be a labor supply of college graduates, where they're going to be choosing between their majors and their occupations, between computer science and other skilled occupation. And the key features the model is going to have is that Indians are going to be uncertain on migration when they're making their human capital and occupation choices. So this is going to create is that they might choose, they're going to think about the expected return between the wage they would earn in the US and the wage they would earn in India when they're actually choosing whether to study computer science or not. We're going to allow for a second channel of brain gain, that is return migration. So once workers are in the US, some of them generally can come back if their H1b visas expire and bring new skills to the US. And then we're going to allow for trade in the IT good and the final good. And a key feature of this model is going to be that we are going to allow for computer scientists to improve the level of technology. So they're going to have a spillover in technology. In some sense, we can think about innovation or something else that will improve the technology on whatever they're working. All right. So we're going to estimate the parameters of the model. The new parameter we're bringing here is the dynamic labor supply elasticity, how workers are going to respond in terms of choosing occupations of computer science, taking into account migration. And then we're going to have a counterfactual where we decrease the H1B cap by 50% during the period of 1995 to 2010. And just to give you a preview of the results, we're going to find that in terms of welfare, both countries gain from immigration. The gains for the US are more muted just because on one hand, they receive the skilled workforce from India, but on the other hand, the Indians crowd out part of the American computer scientists, but they still get a positive welfare gain. And India also gains driven by this brain gain mechanism. Where Indians acquire this valuable skill, and then many of them end up staying in India and producing this extra productivity in India. We're going to show this channel of endogenous occupation choice is important to quantify the gains of migration. A naive model would overstate the migration gains for the US, for example, and would predict brain drain for India. And then we're going to discuss some extensions on the model, particularly heterogeneity inabilities and another type of things we're going to be adding to see how our quantitative results change. All right. So I'm not going to talk too much about the literature, but the way we see the contribution of this paper is that there's been a recent literature that proposed general equilibrium models to understand the implications of migration. And I think what we're adding here is we are incorporating first, this endogenous human capital acquisition that we show that is important to quantify the gains. And second, this uncertainty on migration when making these choices that drives this brain gain that we're going to be talking about later in the results. Okay, so before jumping
Can I ask
Yeah, for sure.
A question. So like I could think of there's two reasons behind kind of the stuff that you're talking about. One is just the market size gets bigger, so it increases the returns to acquiring education in India. But then there's like a option value effect, because like I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get into the United States, but just that option value is valuable. So like, are you going to talk through like those different mechanisms just about the option value, or and then trade is also, the trade in the background too is also kind of affecting like the market size as well. So
I think in the model, both of those things are going to be into effect. Just the option of having the option of migrating, that's already going to push some people into computer science. But then, for example, with the additional computer scientists, India become more productive and the market gets bigger. They start exporting more, and that also, in addition, pulls in more people. So I think both of those channels are going to be present. But I guess we're going to be focusing more on the idea of the option value, I think, through the talk. All right, so before moving forward what we do in the paper, I just wanted to tell you a little bit the context and the story we're trying to tell with some pictures that illustrate how the boom started in the US, and then we are speculating that then might have partially explained what happened in India later. So in the early 1990s, it was the introduction of the internet. And that was, we can think about that as some skill bias technology that biased demand, labor demand towards computer scientists. So if we focus, for example, in this blue line, this is the fraction of computer scientists is a fraction of STEM workers. And we see that particularly during the 1990s, there was a sharp increase on the intensity of the labor market on computer science that it was partially driven by this introduction of this new technology that was the internet. And if we look at how this demand was satisfied, a big part of it was through immigrants. So this is immigrants as a fraction of different occupations. The green line on the top is computer science. So we see that particularly for computer science, there was a sharp increase on the share of immigrants that are computer scientists in the United States. So part of this demand that for computer science that was increased to the internet was met through immigrants, so through the immigrant labor coming to the US. And if we look one level deeper and see who are these immigrants that are coming, we see are predominantly from India. So the green line on the top, this is just the number of foreign computer scientists in the US. And we see that particularly again in the 1990s, there was a very sharp increase of Indian computer scientists compared to other type of countries. Okay, so this demand that the boom of the internet created was mostly met by bringing Indian computer scientists into the US. And if we think about the US, actually the US was a huge employer for Indian workers at the time. So what we do here is we use US and Indian data, and we compute the ratio of Indian computer scientists, Indian IT workers in the US divided by Indian IT workers in India. And we see here is particularly the peak of the IT boom in the 2000s. For every 2 IT workers in India, there was one IT worker, Indian IT worker in the US. So the US actually was a huge source of employment for Indian IT workers and particularly computer scientists. So with this in mind, we can think about the choice of an Indian worker, let's say an Indian college student, they're thinking about choosing computer science relative to other major, and they might look at the relative wage between those occupations in India. And we see that the premium of this is the wage in India of a computer scientist relative to all other college occupations in India. We said the premium was reasonably flat, and then it started increasing later in the 2000s when the IT sector in India increased more. But given that what I showed you before, we know that the US was actually a huge employer. So if someone chose computer science, they know that there's a non-trivial probability that they could get hired from the US and actually migrate to the US. So if it would be reasonable to think that students and workers in certain occupations don't only look at the relative wage, thinking about the wage in India, but they also take something like the expected average of the wage, considering the possibility of migrating to the US. And in this case, the premium of choosing computer science would be much higher than if we just look at the wages in India. Okay? So what do we see in terms of the data? We do see an increase in the share of degrees of people with engineering or computer science degrees over time in India. So we would assume that, I mean, part of this might be driven because of demand in India, but given the huge role of the US, it's reasonable to think that some of these people enrolled in computer science with the prospects of migrating. But what happens in the
Nicolas,
US? Yes,
can I ask you about the previous slide?
Yeah.
When you made the adjustment for the probability of migrating to the US, is that also the probability for non-CS? Like, do Indians work in any meaningful number outside of software development on H1Bs? Because these guys they're like college graduates substituting between CS and non-CS.
Yes, for sure. So in this case, the only thing we're doing is just calculating it for the US, just as an exemplar, just to give an example. So we just do it for the expected average for computer scientists divided by the wage in India. They do go for other occupations, for example, nursing or some others, but the numbers are way lower than what would be in computer science. But I think maybe to make this point right, maybe it would be good just to divide it. It will look very similar, but we could divide it. Thanks.
Just a quick question on on this slide. Engineering includes computer science, and you don't have a sense of what share of computer science is.
Yeah, I think for degrees, the data we had for this was just we just had it all pulled together, so we cannot really separate the degrees themselves whether they're engineering or computer science. But then we're going to be working with occupations that we do see them separately. Okay, so what I was saying is, I mean, presumably some people chose to get an engineer and a computer science degree in order to try to join the US labor market. But what happens with the US labor market, actually, the migrating to the US is very restricted. First, yes, I talked before, the H1B is capped. The visas expire after 3 years, so it's not guaranteed, particularly for Indians, there's a long queue for green cards, so many of them have to return after the H1B is expired. So what we are saying is that some of the firms might have tapped into the skilled workforce that was created partially because people were hoping to migrate and end up either migrating or staying in the US. And what do we see in India? We see that particularly in the later 2000s, the IT sector in India really experiences a boom. And of course, this is driven by many things, but we're speculating here is that partially this boom was helped by the possibility of migrating. And something interesting to see in India is that this export boom is mostly, IT boom is mostly export driven. So this line here, this blue line is IT exports, and we see that the majority of IT output can be explained just through exports. And if we see here the share of global exports, we see that in the early 1990s, the US was the main country that was exporting IT goods. And already by 2005, India overtakes the US in terms of IT exports, the share of IT exports. Okay.
So IT exports go to France?
Probably, yeah. I guess the US is the main consumer, but they do.
No, I know that was a...
No, I know. Okay, so what we want to ask is actually what role did the immigration system played in spreading this tech boom from the US to India through the channel of migration. So we're going to build up a model, but before going to a model, we want to show some additional support in the data to this mechanism that we're saying that when migration prospects change, they indeed have an impact on the occupational choices of Indian workers in India. So what are we going to do? We're going to leverage variation across occupations and regions in India. So here, what we would like to relate is we're going to look at the number of workers, college graduates. This is all going to be about college graduates in India by occupation and region in India. We want to understand if it has any relationship with the migration probability for that occupation in that region. Okay, and the migration probability, the way we're defining it, is the number of Indians that migrated to the US in the past 5 years that are working in that occupation in the US and coming from that region, divided by the total applications that the US received in the past 5 years. Okay? So, of course, if we would try to run this regression, there will be several problems. Some of them, the first one would be just that there are some correlated demand shocks between India and the US. So maybe India is booming in terms of IT for reasons independent than what the US is booming. but they would both push the migration of computer scientists and the local choices of computer scientists. And even if we account for demand shocks, there's a second issue, that is this error term would include, for example, preference shocks that would also influence the occupation that migrants choose and the occupations that Indians choose in India. Okay, so what we're going to do first is to tackle the issue of the correlated demand shocks. We're going to build a demand control using the distribution of industries within an occupation region pair. So this is similar to a Bartik instrument, but instead of using it as an instrument, we're going to be using it as a control for our regression. So here what we're doing is just we're taking a baseline period, the first period in our data, and we're seeing what's the industry distribution in which given workers in a given region, in a given occupation are distributed. And then we interact this with a shifter, that is the total employment in that industry in India, time t, excluding this occupation region pair. So instead of what this is going to capture is, for example, let's say India is booming in IT. The occupation regions that are more intensive in IT are going to have a higher local labor demand control for those years. Okay, and what we hope with this is to capture whatever local demand shocks are going on in India. Okay, so reworking the equation I showed you before, just because it's a log and the denominator of the probability gets absorbed by the fixed effect, we have this regression that is the log, again, the log number of workers in a given occupation, region, time in India against the number of Indians that migrated to the US in the past 5 years to work in an occupation at time t. And I am including the local demand control and certain fixed effects like occupation region, region time. And then just to note here, I mean, one simplification we do here at the beginning is just assuming that the US shock is affecting all regions in a similar way. I mean, later we're gonna show in the robustness, if I have time, we have like we reweight this to actually make it change by region too. But as a first step, what we're doing is just assuming the migration to the US affects all regions in the same way and exploiting the occupation level variation.
So can I ask another question? So like I checked out too because I was going to grab a soda. Maybe I missed this, but why do we have US past 5 years? Why aren't these guys looking forward? Why are they looking backward?
I think what we're thinking, and it's going to be similar to the way people work in the model, is that when they're choosing their occupations, let's say, I don't know, if you need to get trained in computer science, it would take a few years. You would look at like how many people are migrating today, and then use that to form expectations maybe on the future later. So in the model, at least that's the way it's going to work. People are going to see the cap today of the ones that are migrating today, and they're going to use that to form expectations on the cap in the future and make their choices in the future. But I mean, that's the way we're thinking.
So it's like the guys made their education choice 5 years ago. They saw what was going on, and then they went through school. Is that what?
Yeah, sometimes, or they just get retrained in computer science, but they look, for example, okay, who migrated? We're just doing the last 5 years just to get enough sample size to compute these numbers in the US. But yeah, basically they see how many people migrated for a given occupation, and they use that to infer what's the probability of migrating, and that's the way we're thinking about it.
Can I ask about the shift share? Because
yeah,
in typical shift share, when you're like trying to construct an instrument or whatever, the way you think about it is satisfying a relevance condition where like you get the instrument is relevant because you get some part of local demand shifting, and that's good enough for an IV. But when you switch to wanting to soak up stuff as a control, it seems like it needs to absorb a lot more. Like the way, I don't know, there's a literature on the econometrics of using as a shift share where it's like the instrument kind of logic, but is there an analogous literature, or have you thought much about what the requirements are if it's going to just be a control variable?
You mean like the literature of the shift share, for example, that they test the exogeneity of the shares and so on, where
yeah, like those people are thinking about, I just want to get an instrument that serves the function of an instrument, but here you're trying to add it as a control, and it seems to me like, suppose that there's local supply shock, local demand shock, and then you're going to predict the local demand shock with the national component of the demand shock, that still leaves residual local demand shocks plus local supply shocks. And it seems like the residual local demand shocks is still a problem if your goal was to try to control for all that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's true. We're not saying this is like a fully comprehensive, that once you control for this, there's zero demand shocks. And that's why we're going to need an instrument. And on top of the instrument, we're also going to discuss a lot whether our instrument is somehow correlated with this additional demand shocks that are not counted for this thing.
Okay, got it.
So yeah, this is a good transition for the next slide, that even with the demand control, we still need an instrument for Indians in the US for the past 5 years, given that first, we still the error term might have, for example, preferences. In that case, it would bias the coefficient upwards just because Indians might choose more computer science and they also migrate more as computer scientists. But it can also account for several components of demand that are not accounted for this local control. So for example, if there's low demand in an occupation in India, that might push people to migrate to the US in order to work for that occupation, and that would bias the coefficient downwards, and will be, for example, some kind of demand shock that might be unaccounted. So we need an instrument to get around those correlations with the error term. So what we're going to do, what we want to exploit is either a migration policy change or a demand change in the US that is uncorrelated with whatever is going on in India. So first, the main instrument we're going to propose is derived using changes in the H1b cap. So what we're going to do is the H1b cap changed over time. And what we're going to do is we're going to construct a stock of migrants in the US just using the H1b cap. So the first year of the H1b cap was 65,000. The second year was an additional 65,000. We start adding the H1b cap to create a predicted stock just depending on the policy that the US government set. Okay, so our instrument is going to be that predicted H1b stock just using the H1b cap, reweighted by the occupation distribution of Indians in the US in the baseline period. Okay, so so the idea here is that we propose that this instrument is actually uncorrelated with preferences that might be going on in India, and also some other labor demand shocks that can be going on in India. And just to be clear, I mean, if this is correlated with some labor demand shocks in the US, that's not really a problem for us because we want US demand. It would just be a problem if the labor demand shocks in the US are somehow correlated with the Indian labor demand shocks. And we do some tests about that that will explain briefly. So let me show you the results. What do we do? What do we need to do to run this regression? We need to construct a crosswalk between US data and Indian data at the occupation level. So we're going to merge the ACS for the US and a similar database to the ACS CPS, that is the NSS for India. And it's going to be available for 5 periods only because the Indian data is not posted every year. So we're going to use these 5 years of data. And we're going to run the regression that I showed you before. And what do we find? We find a positive and significant effect of the number of Indians who migrated to the US in the past year in a given occupation, such that a 1% increase in the number of Indians in the US in that occupation would increase 0.74% the number of people in that occupation working in India. Okay, and as expected, if we look at, for example, just young workers, that is workers that are below 40, these workers are more responsive than if we look at the whole pool of college graduates. And again, this demand control tends to be always significant and positive also to explain labor choices in India. But if we remove the demand control, the coefficients actually don't change as much. So we do several things, but I think I need to move a bit faster. So just let me tell you a little bit several robustness that we have in the paper. We use different instruments, for example, not just exploiting time variation in the H1b cap or in the number of migrants, but we also look at the shifter as the number of non-Indian migrants by occupation as well, to leverage additional variation in terms of occupation in the US. The results are very robust to that. A second set of analysis we do is our main explanatory variable in our instrument were at the occupation time level, but we were using regions because regions were helpful to control for this local labor demand shocks. But we can also reweight our explanatory variable in our instrument using the propensity of regions to produce workers of some occupations. and that also gives consistent results. We also look at the regression by occupation time, but as I said, it's helpful to look at regions as well, just because it allows us to better control for other confounders that might be affecting occupation choice. And again, we do several tests for correlated shocks. Particularly, we're worried that for some reason, maybe the changes in the H1b are correlated with some other shocks that are going on in India. We don't account with the local labor demand shock. So we had a different control, also in controlling for trade between the US and India, in order to say maybe, okay, migration is correlated with some other business relationship between the US and India. And this is significant, but it doesn't really change at all our coefficient on immigration. And we also discussed that this is probably not driven by also shocks to other countries, since the US is many magnitudes difference in terms of demanding Indian computer scientists compared to, for example, the UK or Canada.
Can you say it just a little more on the occupation by time only specification? Because your instrument only varies really by occupation and time. So are the results extremely similar because it's the same exercise, or is there a subtlety in terms of
the point estimates are very the point estimates are very similar, but a lot of times the precision of the estimates is much better when we account also for the region variation. And I think the idea is, like, when we look at this demand control, if we can just define it at the occupation level, and that's fine. But when we do it at the occupation region level, it accounts for a lot more heterogeneity in the local demand that is lost when we are thinking of the aggregate instrument. But again, I mean, the results are still consistent when we're looking at occupation time.
Thanks.
Nicolas, so there are two ways of interpreting this. So I buy the general mechanism, but I don't know if this is coming because India already had a large comparative advantage in IT services, but before somehow we didn't know how to do it remotely, and now we do. So now, before they were here, and now they're going and they're gone, and they're providing the same service from there. Or is it that they actually learned something, that the world spy is bigger because they came to the US and now they are better than they were before they came?
Yeah, I think part of what we'll be capturing this idea of the comparative advantage will be our local labor demand shock that will be capturing the demand from within India. So we think that, I mean, that would already capture some, for example, if India is just getting better in IT for reasons independent of the US, that should already capture partially that. And in the model, that's going to be, we're going to allow for both channels. So there's going to be an exogenous productivity that happens in India, regardless of the US. But in addition, it's going to be this motivation of migration that incentivizes some additional people to study.
Yeah, and I can defer it if you want.
Yeah.
But what I'm asking is, you show those facts. So before you had the immigrants come and there was a spike, and then they left and they started providing the same services that they were providing potentially in the US, they started providing it from India. So it all seems to be a US demand. The question is, I think that in terms of welfare, the real question is, how much did they learn by coming to the US?
So
are you going to be able to address that, or we don't know? If
so
it's just because
I think in the model, we're going to have both channels. So we're going to have, for example, return migrants that are going to go to the US and then come back with new skills. We're going to show that that's important in terms of welfare for India to explain what's going on. So I think with the model, we're able actually to separate, regardless of immigration, how would India have done in this time. And if we add immigration, we have two channels of this brain gain that we call. One is these people that learn things in the US and come back. And the other one is just people that get motivated to study computer science, but then just are not able to migrate and stay in the US. So all of those channels.
So just to be clear, and then I'll let you go, is that you are going to allow for the cost of trading IT to dramatically decrease in the middle of the
Yes,
market.
yes. So if we shut down migration, India would still have like an IT boom. It's not that IT boom is 100% driven by migration to the US. All right, so let me just talk about the model. I'm gonna go a little faster just because I'm worried that I'm gonna run out of time. So just to give you an overview, we're gonna focus on, there's gonna be two main parts of the model. It's going to be a dynamic labor supply. That is, college graduates in both countries are going to choose between becoming computer scientists or some other occupation. And they're going to choose both college major and occupation. And the key thing here is that if Indians choose CS, they will get some chance of migration. But they were not going to know whether they would actually migrate when they're choosing their occupation. So they will know the probability, but they don't know if they actually will end up migrating when, at the time they're making the occupation for the period. In the product market, we're actually going to have 3 countries, the US and India, and then we're going to add the rest of the world in a very simplified way, just to allow for both countries to capture in the international market when their IT sector improves. There's going to be 2 tradable sectors, final good and IT, we're going to assume it's an intermediate input. And then, as we said, computer science are going to generate a spillover and technology on the country they're working at. So let's start with the labor supply. So workers in both countries are going to work for N periods. There's going to be 3 types of workers: non-college workers, college workers that are computer scientists, and college workers that are some other college occupation. Okay. And the first simplification we're going to make is assume that the decision to go to college is made outside of the model. In an extension, we actually made this decision endogenous. But we're focusing now more on this margin that we think is the most relevant, that is choosing between people that are choosing between computer science or between some other college occupation. So before they join the labor market, they're going to choose their major. That basically their major, the only thing it allows them to join the labor market as a given occupation. So what they do is that they're going to choose their lifetime payoff, their future payoffs of starting their careers as a computer scientist versus the lifetime payoffs of starting their careers as some other college occupation. There's going to be some relative cost of studying computer science relative to other occupations, and there's going to be heterogeneous preferences that are going to be drawn from an extreme value type 1 distribution. So basically, sigma, what it's going to say is the weight of the preferences. If sigma is very large, it means that workers are not going to be very responsive to changes in immigration or in wages. While if sigma is very low, it means that workers are going to be very sensitive in their decisions to changes in immigration and wages that are going to be inside here. And just some other details of the model. For now, we're assuming that all college workers are homogeneous in productivity. Again, we do have robustness where we include heterogeneity in abilities that, if I have time, I'll talk about, because it gives some quantitative differences that are interesting. But just for simplicity, we're assuming they're homogeneous in the main model. And then workers are going to have rational expectations on wages and the migration cap. So they're going to predict what the wages and the cap are going to be, and on average, they're going to be correct on that prediction. All right, so once they join the labor market, they're going to be able to choose their occupations every period. And what matters to choose occupations is going to be the wage they receive in that occupation. There's going to be a switching cost. If the previous period they were in another occupation, they can switch occupations by paying a switching cost. That's going to depend on their age. There's going to be an average taste for each of the occupations, just to rationalize the differences in choices between computer science and other occupations. And they're going to take into account the future payoffs of starting next period in the occupation they choose this period. And again, there's going to be preferences that this sigma is going to be saying something about how responsive workers will be to changes, for example, in the wage or in the migration prospects. Okay, so let's look into migration. So this is mostly in India. We assume US workers do not migrate. So how does the timing work? So workers basically are going to choose an occupation. They're going to work or study in India during that period. And if they work as a computer scientist, they're going to be able to draw an immigration probability at the end of the period. So if they work as a computer scientist one period in India, at the end of the period, they find out where they were able to migrate or not. And if selected, they migrate and they work in the US starting next period. Okay, so basically, when they're choosing computer science today, their future payoffs next period are going to be a weighted average depending on where they get to migrate or not. So if they get to migrate, they're going to start next period working in the US, that is this V US. And if they do not get to migrate, they will stay in India, starting their period as a computer scientist in India. Okay, and to define migration probability, we define it as the cap. That this is going to be important for our counterfactual because it's exactly what we're going to change in our counterfactual. That is the number of people that join the US divided by the total number of computer scientists in India during that period. So some assumptions are in the background here. First, we're forgetting our migration from other countries, given that India is so prevalent. We're just assuming Indian computer scientists are the only people that can migrate to the US. So the cap is just for Indian computer scientists. And the second one is that migration is in some sense deterministic if you get drawn to migrate. If you're a computer science and you get an offer to come to the US, given the wage differentials and given that migration is so restrictive, we're assuming that you will for sure take the offer to go to the US, okay?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe one of this, but what's the, how it actually works? Is there a lot of screening that goes on the American side? Because for these mechanisms, I'm just curious how important this homogeneity assumption might be.
So I think the reason we started doing homogeneity is just we're looking at one specific occupation. And if we look at who are the computer scientists that are migrating, some of them, they do all types of work. Some of them do very basic level programming, others do more sophisticated things. So on average, they're not just coming to do some very skilled research. So that's why we assume homogeneity. But I think in general, in migration in general, it's true in reality that whoever migrates, they are positively selected relative to whoever stays back. So that's why, like in the extension, I said that we assume heterogeneity in abilities, and the nice thing of that extension is we're exactly changing the probability to depend on your own ability. And basically, qualitatively, all the results hold when we think about that process, that migration is selective. But there's some interesting differences in the magnitudes. Like the US gets the very best, and then the marginal workers that are switching in India are on average worse. So it's sort of like gets the welfare results for the US and for India closer. All right.
I thought they would have to almost be selected by definition because the employer has to make a case that there's no US equivalent programmer available.
Yeah, exactly. So it is selective by definition, but there are different. So there's some reasons why not exactly just the very best come. You can think about, for example, the lottery. Certainly, like there are many more applications than the lottery slots. So you could have some very skilled people, but then some other people that are coming as programmers might win the lottery and the others not. So it's a little bit more noise, but you're right. Like we should expect it to be some degree of selectivity. Okay, and just to close for the US, once you're in the US, you work in the US and you get the US wage. But then in the next period, there's a positive probability that you either might stay in the US, but then we have a positive probability to return to India, maybe because your H1b expires, or and you don't get someone else to sponsor you for another visa. So you return to India as a special computer scientist, we call it, a return computer scientist. And these return computer scientists, we're going to assume they have different skills than the computer scientists that never migrated, perhaps because they learned them in the US and they bring them back to India. Okay, I have 18 minutes. Okay, the production side is fairly standard. We're assuming like a static, every period is static in the production side. There's a final good that is a set of varieties that use the IT good as an intermediate input, and then they use a composite of labor. Okay, and the idea of adding the IT as an intermediate good is related to this literature on productivity that says that part of the big contribution of IT in productivity is not just a direct contribution of IT, but it's through improving productivity in many other downstream industries that purchase IT. And then the composite for the final good is going to be a series of nested CS. So I didn't add the equations here, but basically there's going to be first a CS nest between college graduates and non-college graduates. Within college graduates, there's going to be a second nest between computer scientists and college graduates that are not computer scientists. And in India, there's going to be a third nest that is going to be between the computer scientists that are returning and the computer scientists that always stayed in India. Okay, so basically the production function is going to be a set of 3 nested CS for the final good. And then the IT good is going to be very similar. There's going to be a continuum of varieties. They're going to produce using computer science and other college graduates that are not computer scientists. And in India, within computer scientists, there's going to be the return computer scientists and the computer scientists that never migrated. Okay, so we incorporate the possibility of trade. As I said, we're adding, in addition, the rest of the world in a very simplified way, just to allow for India and the US to be able to export to the rest of the world. We're just going to assume, I mean, we're not modeling the labor supply here. We just assume they produce with one type of worker and they produce both goods. And the 3 countries engage in international trade, importing and exporting both goods. And the productivities, both in the final goods sector and in the IT sector, are going to come from a Frechet distribution following a two-sector Eaton-Kortum model. And then basically the price that a variety produced in India that wants to sell it to the US is going to be the cost of producing it in India, the trade cost from the US to India, and divided by this productivity. Okay. And as a final feature, we're going to allow for this T parameter, this average technology in the IT sector, to depend on the number of computer scientists that are working for that sector. So this is going to be, in some sense, an externality in the sector that is created by maybe computer scientists engaging in innovation, the flow of ideas, that's going to affect the level of productivity of the IT sector in the country where the computer scientists are. Okay, so we define the equilibrium. Since our productivities are Frechet, we can define the trade shares. Since our labor market preference shocks are extreme type value, we get a nice expression for the fraction of workers from a given occupation that choose another occupation every period. Okay, so let me just spend like maybe 4 minutes just giving you an overview of how we estimate and calibrate all these parameters before we go to the results. So, I mean, there's many more details on the paper, and I'm happy to talk more later if something is unclear. So how do we estimate the model? So as a first step, we're going to take from the literature several elasticities from the product market. So we have some important elasticities, for example, the substitution between college graduates and non-college graduates, the substitution between CS and non-CS, substitution between return and non-return, and the trade elasticity that we'll mostly take from the literature. As a second step, we're gonna guess the parameters of the labor supply. Okay, the parameters of the labor supply were the parameters of the dynamic problem I showed you at the beginning. They were mostly the occupation switching cost. There was a mean preference for occupations, and education costs. This dispersion parameter was related to how responsive people were to the preferences, and then this weight on the US wage. Okay, so we're gonna guess those, and then we're gonna move to calibrate every year the parameters of the parameters of the production functions of the product sector. So the product sector, remember, it was a static sector. It was a static problem every year. So for every year, we're going to calibrate, for example, the technology parameters, the trade costs, the production function parameters, and so on to match certain trends. So here is, I think, the question that Cecilia asked before, that if we still are capturing, for example, the fact that India would still have experienced a boom. And this is why we are. So, for example, we are going to estimate every year the technology parameters and the trade costs using, for example, backing them out from the trade flows. And then we're going to take those parameters as given. So then in the counterfactual, when migration is lower, we're still going to allow for India to improve their baseline technology in IT because we're calibrating this every year. So we calibrate all these parameters every year. This is going to capture basically how demand is changing over time. And then we are going to use our model to compute certain moments that are related to the labor supply parameters. We're going to compare our simulated moments with some data moments that we have for those moments that are informative of the labor supply. If these moments are different, we're going to go back to step 2, adjust the guess parameters, recalibrate the time varying parameters, and calculate the moments again. And the algorithm is going to do it over and over again until we finally identify the parameters of the labor supply, basically by matching the simulated moments with certain moments of the data. Okay. And a final elasticity that is important is the technology response, how much technology changes when there are more computer scientists. And here we use patents to try to estimate this elasticity, and we get an elasticity that is very similar to other papers in the literature that already try to estimate this spillover. Okay. Sorry, I'm not providing more details, but I'm happy to answer questions if someone has questions. All right. Okay, so we look at the, once we have our model estimated, basically the way the model works here, what we're doing is we're increasing the wage by 1% just to understand how the relative labor supply of computer scientists relative to other college graduates changes. And the way the model works is when we increase, for example, 1% the wage in the US, that period we actually get a small response. Why? Because the workers that adjust are maybe just the workers that can switch occupations paying the switching costs. But as time goes by, in addition to the people that switch occupations paying the switching costs, we have the pipeline of education that responds with some lag to the labor supply. So in some sense, what we want to say here is with the model, we're capturing that the short-term supply elasticity is going to be different than the long-term elasticity, because the long-term elasticity is also going to have the education pipeline feeding, responding to wages, and then joining the labor market in response to those changes in wages. And in India, what we do is like this includes like, this is the same shock in the US we included for India, and of course Indians also respond to a US wage, but much less than US workers. We test the model, some moments that we're not targeting, and I think it does a good job with some key moments, particularly the relative wages between the US and India. And then we can move to the counterfactual. So what are we going to do in the counterfactual? As we said before, we're going to use that cap parameter that we had in the model, and we're going to reduce it by 50% every period starting in 1995. So the cap is basically a flow. So the first year, this change is going to be very tiny. But as we go by, the change of this 50% reduction of the cap is actually going to be pretty significant after all these years go by. Okay, so thinking about the implications of the model, there are several ambiguous predictions that we want to test with our quantitative model. So the first one is what happens in India. So we said, like, a strand of the literature argued for brain drain. The skilled people are leaving, so India, in some sense, is losing college graduates and computer scientists. But on the other hand, we're allowing for this possibility of brain gain through the two channels. One, just workers choosing computer science to migrate and then end up staying because they don't get drawn in the lottery, or return migrants that can come back to work in India after working in the US. On one hand, we can think that the US is bringing computer scientists, so that would expand the IT sector in the US. But on the other hand, the Indian computer science compete with the US computer scientists, so they might choose some other occupations. So that would go against the US increasing as much their IT sector. And since India is also increasing the number of computer scientists, that might shift production more to India. And then later, there's just some distributional ideas. We have more computer scientists, so there's more competition in the computer science market that lowers the wages. But at the same time, they improve productivity. So we could expect they also can have a positive impact if the productivity impact is sufficiently large.
So Nicolas,
yeah.
Before you go to the counterfactual, I think you need to make a convincing case. I'm not terribly convinced, especially given the homogeneity assumption and selection that people were mentioning before, that people that come to the US, in the model, they're hardwired to come back different from they were before. But what if selection played the larger role there? How much were you able to actually identify between selection of the people who came were ex ante better, or they got better afterwards? How is that? What are the moments in the data that helps you identify between those two channels?
So I guess this is going to come up more for the model that actually allows for this heterogeneity and selective migration. So maybe if we have time, maybe we can discuss that part, that I think we can just understand the quantitative difference between the baseline with homogeneity and the other one to understand the potential differences. So let me just get to that, and I think it's going to be clearer. All right, so let's just look at the baseline results. I'm just plotting them for 2010. What happens, we find that both countries actually gain from, the way I'm going to talk about the counterfactual is going from the counterfactual, that is restricted migration, to a real. So what happens when we allow for immigration in some sense? And we find that both countries actually gain from immigration. The gains from the US are muted partially because the Indian computer scientists crowd out some of the US computer scientists. So the total number of computer scientists in the US increases by 1% of the brain gain in the model. And why is this important? Well, we compared it with two models where we don't allow for this endogenous relocation of occupations. So basically, workers are trapped in their own occupations. And what we find, for example, let's look at this column. This is a model in which we are not allowing workers to relocate across occupations. The gains for the US are much larger, just because in addition to the immigrants, they actually get all the US workers cannot relocate, so they capture more of the spillover. And in the case of India, I would predict just pure brain drain. College graduates are leaving. Some people are switching because of the prospects of migration, but these people, in this case, they're not switching because they cannot switch. So then basically India is just losing computer scientists.
Nicolas,
and then,
are these, since you have a dynamic model, these in the new stationary equilibrium, or this is a transition? Welfare number.
This is basically a transition in 2010, like at what point they are in 2010. Okay. So what's driving the welfare gains? Well, in the US, the welfare gains from the US are mostly driven by non-college graduates. So these are complementary to the college graduates. So basically the immigrants just create more college graduates. So the main gains are captured by inputs that are complementary to the college graduates, that are the non-college graduates. In India, what's driving most of the welfare gains is actually the non-computer science college graduates. Why? Because people choose computer science more just because of the prospects of migrating, and that pushes up the demand for both computer science and non-computer science. And now there's fewer non-computer scientists in the college market. So then that pushes up the wages more. So most of the welfare gains are captured by that group in India. And in the last 4 minutes, let me just talk about what Cecilia was saying. But we do like multiple robustness checks. We evaluate how important is return migration for the results. We look at the spillover is actually key to determine this brain gain, because the reason why computer science is special is because they create this spillover that motivates people to choose this occupation. We look into several other things, but let me just talk about the heterogeneity in abilities. So what do we do in this model? Here we make some simplifications. So this model, we just look at it with perfect foresight just because it's computationally more intensive. But basically what we allow is for people to have, when they join the labor market, they draw an ability for work as computer science as a non-computer scientist, and they carry that ability throughout their careers that they're working. And the probability of immigration is going to depend positively on these abilities. So if you have a higher ability of computer science, it's going to be more likely for you to migrate. So how are the results? As I said, qualitatively, they are similar, but there's some interesting quantitative differences. So what happens here? So the welfare gains for the US in the perfect foresight model were close to zero. They were positive, but close to zero. If we look at the model with heterogeneous abilities, the welfare gains in the US are much larger. And why? Because the people that are coming to the US are on average much more able, and they produce more of that spillover that the computer science are generating. So in that case, the welfare gains in the US would actually be higher if we would allow for the selective migration. What happens in India? Again, there's still a component of brain gain because more people are choosing computer science driven by the prospects of migration, but the welfare gains are lower. And what is driving that is just that the guys that are moving from non-computer science to computer science when we allow for migration are marginally the guys that had like lower ability to work as computer scientists. So in that case, the welfare gains for India are lower than in the baseline model. So qualitatively, I think it's easier just to look at the model with homogeneity. And I think there are reasons to say, because of the lottery and because the type of tasks the Indians perform, that they're not necessarily positively selected, given that we're looking at this very special occupation. But if we consider positive selection, I mean, the results are still qualitative, but they sort of narrow down the type of welfare gains. And I think I have 1 minute, so let me just conclude. Basically, what we find is that reducing migration reduces global welfare by 0.14%. And if we turn it into monetary numbers, 6.6 billion or $50,000 per migrant. But most of these gains are actually accrued by the migrants with the wage differential they get in the US. We show that accounting for this endogenous skill acquisition is important, and it's important to model several features to really understand the general equilibrium adjustments. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to stay in the remaining half an hour later if there's more questions or conversation.
Thanks, Nicolas. And we even started a minute or two late and finished a minute or two early. So it's
okay.
you're. Can I ask you one question? I didn't see, and I probably missed it. My kids were banging on the window, but when people migrate, do they send remittances back or anything like that?
So
the model or
they,
the
they
data?
do, but we do have a specification where we try to quantify remittances and see like what happens if we allow for example, the fraction of remittances that Indians remit, and we calculate it using the computer science income. But it doesn't really change at all. It's like it's very small compared to the actual numbers of the wage. So
Gotcha. So people don't send very much back. Is that what happens?
yeah, at least like when we in the quantitative model, when we add remittances, it almost doesn't change our results. So it means
What about in the data though?
yeah, it's pretty small. I think like in the thing we did, it was something like 3% of the income or something for Indian
Gotcha.
college
Pretty
graduates.
small.
So it wasn't very significant. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Well, we have a few minutes, and I won't. I raised the threshold for like a question before when I said it had to be a really good question. It can be like the quality of my questions. So if anyone else wants to sort of jump in and ask anything, or we can turn it over to Kim Rule, who's back and in charge. So anyone, just feel free to jump in. So why don't we do this? Why don't we take like a 5-minute break, because it's really hard to focus for more than 10 minutes at a time these days. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll start at 4:05, and we'll just leave it open if anyone has questions. Okay, for either one of the papers. I'll ask Nicolas and Daniel to talk though. Like, if Daniel, how would his results have been different if he used your production function? Because he said it was standard, and he took the estimates from the literature.
That's a good question. I wasn't really thinking about it in those terms. So,
not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting. It's like it's a natural question now that we are putting the two papers together. So what we have looked in our context was, as I mentioned, we didn't show any of those results. Was we looked at also on the labor end of things, and in the French data we do observe very detailed occupational codes. So we did observe that large firms do relatively hire more of exactly those kinds of workers. Now, I guess in practice it is also true that these types of policies, like open immigration policies, are typically also lobbied by those larger firms. So it's probably true that these immigration policies are going to also be disproportionately helpful to those, and perhaps there is an effect on concentration as well. If you want to.
I was just thinking there's some increasing returns to scale in your model that the previous paper doesn't have, and so it seems like the welfare gains might have been bigger. Using the type of production functions you were thinking about from, lowering the cost of people migrating, or. So right, so I was thinking more like the general equilibrium side of it.
If I want to do a mapping between the two, it would at the end look very similar to reducing the effective price of IT. Right, so because the way you would think about it, and the way we've been thinking about sort of expanding on what we did, was to create a complement, sort of a bundle of IT inputs that includes not only just hardware and software, but also labor services of IT workers. And if you allow for more immigration in that context, you're effectively also lowering the cost of that bundle. And so in terms of the implications on the supply side, it would look very similar to what we showed. So basically, to summarize, ultimately the effect goes into two directions within and across firms, and the two in the aggregate may not show a large impact on the aggregate returns to scale. But within the firm, there's an effect, and then there's a reallocation toward. But yeah, I mean, it's a natural question for us to be thinking about the implication on the labor end of things, and for.
Yeah, at least from some other work that I'm doing, actually, large firms are also more intensive in immigrants too. So
yeah,
we do see in the data that they hire a larger share of immigrants.
So do you actually, now that I guess we are talking about this, and I guess we still have like a couple more minutes, there's this discussion, I guess, in the policy circles at least, about to what extent some of these workers are not really technically actually IT workers, but rather really just firms outsourcing under the auspices of, having immigrants.
Yeah.
So in terms of just like the sheer numbers, do you have any sense of to what extent it could be?
Yeah, I think actually Indian companies get a bad reputation in some sense just because they say like to pay low wages, but actually if we look at the wages paid by US IT firms, Indian firms actually pay pretty much the same wages. But yeah, it's true what you're saying, that given the way now there's so many more applications than whatever the cap is, that now they're arguing that a lot of these big Indian outsourcers just can apply, you know, for like thousands and thousands of visas and just sort of game with the lottery in some sense. And yeah, there's been some proposals sort of like to improve the allocation. So one option was, for example, imposing a minimum wage. So if you want to hire an H1b worker, you need to pay them more than $100,000 or something in order to avoid this idea that maybe people are coming, you know, to that you still want to bring the most skilled people you can in some sense. So like I still think like, you know, Indian programmers are still providing a valuable service, but some people are arguing that conditional on having a cap, then maybe the system should be reformed in order to bring the people that are like the highest earners or something. Yeah.
Another thing that I thought might be interesting, I'm sure you know the paper by Bill Kerr that shows how some of the services of these expats, Indian expats in the US, is through finding the right connections and back in India. So that seems to be another potential channel here in your context, right? That if there are search frictions, the fact that there are, let's say, there's some outsourcing need, and the fact that there are immigrant workers in the US, that facilitates, lowers the cost of search.
Yeah. I think that definitely is going on. Like I would say that at least in the period that we're studying, I would suspect that's more second order, just because when we control, for example, in the empirical specifications for trade between India and the US, that we assume it will respond to these business connections, it doesn't really change the impact of migration that we're estimating. So for that, I'm guessing it's more a second order, but I would guess that's definitely there, at least for FDI, like for sure immigrants matter in order to communicate from the affiliates to the parents or something.
Great. I agree, immigrants matter. So I guess let's move on to Conor next. Okay, Conor, I see at least one of your co-authors is in the room as well. So
yeah, Fabian's in the chat. So if you have any questions that I'm not answering, I'm sure he'll get to that.
Great. So we've got Conor Walsh telling us about skilled scalable services. Go ahead, Conor.
Thank you very much. You'll see my screen.
Yep, perfect.
Great. So yeah, this is joint with Fabian, who's here, and Sharat Ganapati at Georgetown. So I guess what this paper is about is that historically, it's been the case that a fairly robust fact of economic growth is that poor areas tend to grow their incomes faster than rich areas. Indeed, we know from the classic JPE of Barrow and Saleh Martin that poorer US states for most of US history saw their incomes grow by about 1% more than richer states. And this led to a long, slow period of convergence across space. But there's been a number of recent papers that have documented that sometime around 1980, this process actually stopped. And indeed, there's been a new urban bias in economic growth in that the richest, densest cities in the US have seen the fastest income gains, persistently faster wage growth over the last sort of 40 years. So we do two things in this paper. First, we're going to show you that essentially all of this urban bias in the last 40 years in economic growth is accounted for by a small number of service industries that we call skilled scalable services. And basically all of the urban bias is happening within these services. Outside these services, essentially not much has changed. And the second thing we're going to do on top of documenting that is we're going to give you an explanation that we think is kind of compelling. We're going to show you that what's special about these services is, well, they use a lot of ICT in keeping with today's theme. They're very skill intensive, and we're going to show you that if you just take the ICT price declines that we've seen in the data and interact them with the comparative advantage of cities, you can reproduce quantitatively a lot of the trends that we see in the data for these services. So what are these services? Well, fundamentally, they're services that are skill intensive, that create and communicate information. And we think about the role of ICT in these services as helping to expand their scale. ICT both increases the volume of information they can create and the quality of the information they can create and trade with other industries. So what we're going to do to define them is for each 2-digit Nike service industry, we're going to compute the skill intensity of that service industry. And basically we'll just call that the share of college workers in the workforce, and the ICT intensity of that industry, where we're just going to take that from national accounts as the share of software and hardware in the total capital stock. And we'll call skilled scalable services those 2-digit Nike industries that have the highest rankings in both of these measures. So what does that look like? Well, here I'm plotting on the x-axis the ICT intensity rank of all the services in the US economy. And then on the y-axis, I'm plotting the skill intensity rank. And we'll call skilled scalable services these 4 service industries up here. So management of companies, which is basically headquarters, professional services, information, which is tech, and finance and insurance. So you can see there's a lot of sort of heterogeneity. There's a bunch of service industries that use a lot of ICT, but aren't really that skill intensive. There are some service industries, like kind of what we do, that are very skill intensive, education and healthcare, but don't actually use a lot of ICT. And then there's some service industries that are neither intensive or in both these measures. So things like retail, accommodation, food services. And what we see in the data is that these 3 quadrants tend to behave kind of similarly in the time series and across space, is really this upper right-hand quadrant that looks very different.
Can I just pause there, Conor?
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to ask you about sort of retail, transportation, warehousing. I thought we knew that, Walmart's productivity growth, which was all about supply chain management, contributed like percentage points to US productivity growth in the 90s. That's not showing up here.
Well, in what sense? I'm not showing anything about accounting for productivity growth here. I'm just ranking the industries essentially.
Well, that supply chain management relies on ICT.
True.
I mean, so this intensity measure is maybe not capturing the importance of ICT for these
Walmart.
sectors.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of what we're going to be doing is establishment based. So we'll see things like headquarter services, which you might expect a lot of the gains to the ICT intensification of Walmart accrue to the workers who work at the headquarters. And that's kind of what we see. So essentially, if you're a low skill worker working in branches of Walmart or CVS or whatever across space, you don't really see any intensive wage gains. It's really the skill intensive headquarter services that see most of the divergence. But let me show you the facts first, and then we can talk about whether this is the right ranking. So, and yeah, just for the rest of the talk, I'm going to save myself some space, and I'm going to call skilled scalable services just by the acronym SSS. So what does the new urban bias look like in the data? Well, this is one kind of very simple way of showing it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the commuting zones in the US, and I'm going to put them into 10 bins with equal amounts of population in each bin. And I'm going to plot the average wage in that bin relative to the first decile. So this largest bin is essentially 2 or 3 cities. It's New York and Chicago. And then the smallest bin is many, many small commuting zones. And they have about 1/10 of the US population in each one of these bins. And yeah, so I'm plotting the average wage in this top density decile versus relative to the smallest density decile in each bin. What you can see is that this is one way to measure the urban wage gradient, essentially how wages increase with density. This is controlling for absolutely nothing. This is just aggregate wages. And since 1980, this gradient has gotten a fair bit steeper. So it used to be that a random worker in New York would make about 40% more than a worker in the smallest commuting zones in the US. Now it's about 60% more. So if you break this out across industries, if you just take out the 4 SSS industries, you essentially get that the urban wage gradient hasn't changed at all. there's essentially no difference between 1980 and 2015, the average wages relative to the smallest places in the US. And this whole, you can disaggregate this even further. This is all the non-SSS industries. You can disaggregate this quite a bit further and you get a very similar result. So where's all the action coming from? Well, it's the SSS industries. So in 1980, again, SSS workers on average would make about 40% more than in New York than the really smallest places. In 2015, it's more than double, essentially. Now, this is controlling for nothing, and I'm going to show you a fair bit about what's going on. Obviously, there have been skill intensity changes across space in this period, and I'm going to disaggregate that for you. So I'm going to start by documenting some of the facts that lie behind this change in the urban wage density gradient, essentially. And to do so, I'm going to use a couple of the major US labor market data sets. So we're going to use the LBD, which is the census establishment, the universe of establishments in the US, and that's payroll, employment, zip codes for almost all establishments since 1980, and that comes from the business register and tax records. We'll supplement that with the QCEW, which is a public data that you can look at, which is very similar stuff, payroll and employment for county and industries since 1990. And that comes from a different data source, unemployment insurance program receipts, but a lot of the, pretty much everything I'm going to say holds consistently across these two data sets. And since we can't really have a measure of skill in either one of these, we're also going to supplement the analysis with just the decennial census and the American Community Survey, which is microdata since 1980, and that'll give us a measure of skill of workers across space. So the first fact I want to show you is that there's been rapid and urban bias wage growth in SSS. So if I take just the average wages by industry in the macroeconomy since 1980, and I plot them relative to 1980 over the last sort of 40 years, most industries have seen their average wages evolve pretty similarly since 1980. There's been sort of 35 to 40% growth. This is real wages, by the way. I've deflated by the CPI here. But SSS looks like it's just on a completely different trajectory altogether. So it's seen its real wages, adjusting by CPI, more than double in this time period. Okay, what does that look like?
One question about the data here. So this is from the LBD?
This is the QCEW. If you do it in the LBD, you get a very similar sort of trend. The thing is, you have to do a lot of disclosure if you want to get each one of these data points. So we took out 5-year intervals, but this is every year since 1980.
So then in terms of definition of sectors, just going back to my question, so yeah. An establishment is defined, so it's like Walmart HQ will be defined as retail, or it will be
Walmart HQ will be SSS for us, and a Walmart retail establishment will be retail.
Okay, so it's defined at the level of the establishment, not at the industry code.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, in the LBD, at least we can assign industry codes to each establishment, and we'll aggregate that way.
And just when you're deflating by the CPI, are they place-based CPIs or just the national one?
No, this picture is just purely national. Okay.
But you'll do something about that later on, right?
Certainly.
Gotcha.
So what does it look like across space? Well, again, this picture will be the LBD. We're going to take, again, those 10 density decile bins, and I'm going to plot the wage growth within industry in these density decile bins relative to the first decile. So you can see there's really not been much or any systematic urban bias across industries outside of SSS. So wages haven't really grown faster in these top density decile bins relative to the smallest places in the US. But again, SSS just looks very different. So wage growth if you're in an SSS establishment in, say, New York or San Francisco is in this 9th density decile bin, you're going to see much faster wage growth than the first density decile bin. So that's just wages, like I said, controlling and disaggregating for nothing. Obviously, some of that is going to reflect the skill composition, changing skill compositions both in the aggregate and across space. So what's been going on with skill compositions? Well, there's been rapid and urban bias skill deepening in SSS as well. So if you look at the college, non-college worker ratio, which is kind of the relevant statistic in most macro models, and you just plot this relative to 1980 across industries, there's definitely been a fair bit of skill deepening since 1980, and this has occurred across industries. But SSS just, again, looks like it's on a completely different trajectory. So the college, non-college worker ratio has gone up by like 250% in SSS. And remember, I define these services as being particularly skill intensive in 1980. So this is starting off of a very high base, and they're becoming much, much more skill intensive, much faster than any other industry. What about across space? Well, I'll use the decennial censuses for these, and I'll show you the growth in the college, non-college worker ratio relative to that first density decile again. And so you see here that across industries, there has been urban bias skill deepening. It's certainly the case that skilled workers generally are moving to cities across the US, but across industries, they seem to be doing it at a fairly kind of constant rate across industries, except for in SSS. So there we just see like sort of massive skill deepening for this particular group of industries relative to that first decile. Now, in reference to that first factor I was talking about, you might ask, well, how much of that faster wage growth in SSS that's occurring in these dense places is just the skill deepening? So we do a bunch of decompositions in the paper. Basically about 30 to 40% of the outsized wage growth in the densest places represents skill deepening, but most of it is actually fast wage growth within skill groups across space that's causing the urban wage gradient to shift upwards for these services.
Just one other data question.
Yeah, please.
So this is based on occupations or based on the industry in which you work?
The industry in which you work. So I'll say a little bit more about occupations in a sec, but this is all industry classification.
So if I work at Walmart,
yeah,
in Walmart headquarters, in this case, I'm not going to end up in scalable services. I'm going to end up somewhere else.
No, I mean, maybe I missed that, but if you, on the census, if you say you work yes, no, that's exactly right. So you're going to be classified by whatever the census says what industry you're in.
No, but I'm confused now. NAICS industry codes are assigned at the level of establishments. So if
they are for the LBD. This when we're talking about skills, we don't observe education in the LBD. So this is all from the decennial census.
Okay, so that I guess depends on whether the worker correctly interprets the question about what industry that they should be saying they work in headquarters services.
Right.
Okay.
Right, that's exactly right. So yeah, I agree. There's some measurement issues here. This is kind of the best we can do with the data that's available, I think.
Yeah, just on that, Jonathan, I think in the appendix we do a little bit of, we kind of compare, for example, in the location of the Walmart headquarters, we compare the LBD and the census. And it really seems that, there are some workers who are saying they work in retail, retail when they work at Walmart headquarters instead of, the headquarters. We are a little bit, we are kind of okay with that, I think, because the bias would go in the other direction. So it would be people who are actually in SSS, misclassifying themselves as retail, and hence kind of bringing up the skill ratio in retail, which doesn't seem to be very strong in this graph.
So the third fact I want to talk about is there's been rapid and urban biased ICT capital adoption in SSS. So again, I'll start with the aggregate. Here I'm going to plot the technology share of the capital stock, the software and hardware across industries since 1980. So it's true, pretty much all industries are getting more ICT intensive during this period. But again, SSS started off at a high base and has been sort of rapidly intensifying their ICT investments as a share of the total capital stock since 1980. Across space, well, we're kind of—
Sorry to keep banging on this. So in this previous figure, so Walmart is in scalable services, or where is Walmart?
For this, yeah, I mean, this is just the BEA asset tables, and so you're counting up the total share of capital at the industry level. And that's a good point. I don't know what Walmart would be classified as here. I don't think they split it out by establishment. It's probably done at the firm level, but I need to check that for sure. And well, that's relevant to what I'm saying right here. So in the census, at least, we have some micro data on ICT investments coming from a couple of surveys and the capital expenditure survey. It's also done at the firm level, but what we're going to do is apportion the ICT investment to each establishment in proportion to employment. And when we do that, we can compute some measure of software investment per employee at the establishment level. And we can plot out the urban bias of this software investment sort of in a kind of a consistent manner. And if you look at the other industries, there doesn't really seem to be much of an urban bias in the ICT software investment, but you do see it quite strongly in SSS, in that SSS industries do concentrate more in dense cities, it's true, and they're doing much more ICT investment. But even accounting for that, you see kind of a stronger gradient here of software investment per employee for SSS than you do outside. Yeah, I wish I had ICT spending at the establishment level, but I don't. This is sort of what we've got. This is software. We're kind of we're still waiting for disclosure on this. We're going to bring out hardware investment per employee quite soon. Okay, so just to summarize that, rapid wage growth in SSS, the urban bias is only in SSS industries. There's been rapid skill deepening in SSS, and you see far more urban bias in SSS than other industries. And there's been rapid ICT adoption in SSS, and urban bias looks like it's only there for the SSS establishments. Now, we do a whole bunch of sort of robustness and discussion of these facts in the paper. One thing we get asked about a lot is this really an industry story? Is this an occupation story? And we have some things we can say about this. Basically, what it looks like in the census is that if you classify, the natural thing you might ask about, is this just all cognitive non-routine occupations? And is SSS just a stand-in for cognitive non-routine occupations? Basically, what we see in the census is that if you're in a C&R occupation, but you're not in SSS, you really don't see any urban bias wage growth. So like our example that we always bring up is doctors. So doctors have seen essentially flat wage growth across space. So their wages are growing and growing kind of nicely, but they're not doing it in an urban bias way. If you're in a non-CNR occupation, but you are in SSS, you're also seeing urban bias wage growth. So, in shorthand, basically the secretaries at big banks and Goldman Sachs, they're also doing quite well, and they're seeing their wages change in an urban bias way. So occupations is not really a sufficient statistic to talk about industry. We really do think this is happening at the industry level, not the occupation level. So yeah, so that's in terms of sort of just data, explaining the urban bias wage growth just in terms of a set of industries. Now we're going to give you what we think is an explanation or a quantitative explanation for what we think is going on. So we're going to construct a model of skilled scalable services and other industries and think about the adoption or the incentives to adopt ICT across space. So to do this, I'm going to think of a setting where the economy is just a discrete set of locations.
Before you get there, can you just tell us, I missed it. Can you tell the story for why this ends up concentrating in the biggest cities?
Yes, I mean, that's essentially what I'm gonna do now with the model. So, I mean, SSS industries, they've always concentrated in dense cities long before the arrival of ICT. So there's some sort of fundamental productive advantage to doing SSS type work in dense cities. We, in this paper, we don't really get into modeling what that is. We're going to take that just as given, as a fact, that there's some advantage to being in a dense city for doing SSS. And we're going to think about the interaction of those comparative advantages at the industry level across space with an aggregate decline in the price of ICT. And as ICT becomes cheaper, it's going to naturally be, you're going to want to invest most in ICT in the places that have comparative advantage for SSS. Given that SSS is going to use ICT most intensively, you're going to get biased ICT investment across space.
Okay.
So Conor, just to clarify.
Yeah.
Since you have SSS defined as both the student density and the ICT, then just being intensive in ICT doesn't benefit in the same way from the price decline. There's got to be some bias in the skill bias in the ICT price decrease, right?
Definitely. So I'll talk about that right now. Exactly. So yeah, it's not just, it's also a skill ratio story that we think, I'll get to that now.
Can you also just say, I mean, just since you are talking about certain industries that tend to be high paying industries, and you might think that like tax policy is somehow related to how those people in those industries are compensated. Is that not something that we need to think about, with the massive change in marginal tax rates for finance guys or high income guys?
Probably. We don't have a lot to say about taxes, I guess. I mean, the one thing, we always find it helpful to think about is, well, do these necessarily have spatial implications if you just take the tax rate and change it for finance workers? Would that cause finance wages to go up disproportionately in New York? It's not clear to me that it would. I mean, I'm sure you could cook up some story, but I think,
well, we have a progressive we have a progressive tax system, and it is more expensive to live in New York. And so if you cut the marginal tax rates for the highest guys, makes it more valuable to live in New York.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's something we haven't given a lot of thought to. But.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Thanks. I got the intuition now. Thank you.
Conor,
Go ahead.
I'm going to piggyback on George's comment, because I think you've mostly shown us price growth stuff. You haven't really shown us much about quantities, right? So, the finance sector has a lot of kind of people in it. One is like, your community bank branch in Iowa, and the other one is a hedge fund on Wall Street. And if, only one of those responds to a change in tax policy, you see wage growth. I think you can, or you probably will discipline this in the model where you'll use quantity of labor and people migrating and stuff to say whether it's, just the same people making higher returns versus.
That's right. So, I mean, we do a fair bit of that in the paper, and I'm going to show you now some of it. But essentially, one thing to keep in mind with SSS is that the overall employment share of SSS hasn't changed much since 1980. So while we've seen a lot of skill deepening of these services, you're essentially getting low skill workers leave these services. So those kind of relative skill changes are going to help us say something about what is going on when aggregate prices change. But yeah, maybe I'll be able to clarify a bit more when I get to the model. Anyone else before I start digging into this? So yeah, essentially we're going to think about a discrete set of locations, and there's going to be some masses of high and low skilled labor in the aggregate. Sorry. And workers are going to choose two things in both these skill groups. They're going to choose what sector they want to work in, which can either just be SSS or it can be non-SSS. And they're going to choose a location they want to live in. And locations are going to differ in their sectoral comparative advantage, essentially. So some locations are just going to be fundamentally good at doing SSS and some are not. And we're not going to get into the reasons why that might be. We're going to take that as some given exogenous feature of the economy. Now, output within each sector and each location is going to be produced by heterogeneous firms. And I'll specify what they are in a sec, but the other thing I'll say is the environment's just static. We kind of punt on the dynamics here. We're going to think about a sequence of static equilibria as the aggregate ICT price changes. And all markets are just perfectly competitive on the output side.
So just to be clear,
yes, please.
Go ahead. Doreen.
So a firm here in some sense is an establishment,
yes,
because it has a location attached to it.
Yes.
So you're not getting into this sort of ICT span of control type stuff that Danial was talking about.
Yeah, we're not. We think it's interesting. We're essentially going to be looking at the establishment level and not kind of the firm choice about where to expand to in space. But I agree, those are important considerations for thinking about these sort of things.
And there's a coincidence between the location's comparative advantage and their size to get the urban bias.
In equilibrium, there will be, in particular, more productive locations will host more people just in equilibrium. But we'll take that initial distribution as kind of given, and then we'll see how it changes as we change some of the macro parameters.
But it's not just the level of productivity, it's the comparative advantage in SSS, right?
Right, that's right. The model I'm going to talk about has really sort of three ingredients. So one is scale at the firm level or the establishment level. So ICT capital, we're going to think about it allowing SSS firms to expand their scale. And we're going to think about ICT as a fixed cost technology that allows you to lower the marginal costs of production of knowledge or the output goods of SSS. And like we were just saying, there can be different local returns to scale due to local comparative advantage. Some places are naturally good at doing these sort of activities, and that's going to interact with the investment decision about how much ICT to adopt. And third, we're going to think about changes in ICT potentially changing the skill intensity at the firm level. In particular, that there might be skill deepening with scale. So we're going to adopt a non-homothetic CES production following on from looking like what Danial did in a somewhat similar way. And it's quite important that you do this. If you only think about this as kind of a macro framework for ICT adoption, thinking about sort of, I don't know, Crissell, Hanyan, Rees, Rule, Violante, you get very counterfactual predictions for what should happen to low skill workers across space as you get ICT and CT intensification in dense cities. In particular, without some sort of non-homotheticity that we're going to present, you get like a massive increase in demand for low skill workers in New York that is just kind of completely counterfactual. So we think these kind of ingredients are pretty necessary to think about what's going on in the data. But what we're going to look at is sort of each firm having a non-homothetic CES production function where output is going to depend on a couple of things. So output at the firm level is going to depend on some firm level efficiency term Z. It's going to depend on the mix of high skill and low skill labor that you employ, where the marginal productivities of these high skill and low skill labor are both going to depend on scale. So Y is actually going to be defined implicitly as the solution to this equation at the firm level. So if you have more output, that's going to affect the marginal productivity of high skill labor relative to low skill labor. And here are these alphas are going to be local comparative advantage terms or local productivity shifters showing up that also influence the marginal productivity of high and low skill labor in a location at the firm level. So yeah, output's defined implicitly as the solution to this. You're going to have a fixed cost technology, and you can pay a fixed cost C in units of the final good to invest in ICT capital. So the ICT capital decision is really a two-stage thing. First, you need to pay a fixed cost to decide whether you're going to invest in ICT at all. And second, you're going to be able to choose how much capital you want to invest in after you've made that fixed cost decision. And if you choose to pay that ICT fixed cost, your efficiency is going to improve from some baseline level that's idiosyncratic across firms, and it's going to increase by the amount of ICT capital that you choose to adopt, where K, you can choose as much K as you want, and there's some sort of diminishing returns to efficiency in ICT capital after you decided to adopt. Z, that fundamental efficiency, we're just going to assume that's drawn from some exogenous distribution across space that's spatially invariant. So all the differences come from these comparative advantage terms, and they also come from the endogenous decisions about how much capital to adopt.
John, so a quick question.
Yeah.
You don't have the sort of spillover effects that, say, Elisa has in her job market paper. I just wondered if you'd thought about putting in maybe the location level Ys rather than the firm level Ys in this production function.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that. You could make these alphas, say, these like fundamental productivities in a sector and a region depend on, say, the amount of skilled labor in space. I think what we're going to show you is you really don't need to think about an endogenous mechanism of agglomeration to generate most of what's going on in the data. You can just take those comparative advantages as sort of given in 1980 and vary just one macro price, and you'll get most of the action about what's going on. We can't obviously rule out interesting agglomeration stories where places endogenously become more productive as skilled people move in. What we're going to show you is you don't need to think about that to generate what's going on in the data.
So one question about this, are you going to get the predictions then on the establishment size, how the establishment size changes?
You are. Yeah, you are. So we're going to, I don't actually have the slide here. I should have put it in, but we do sort of generate size predictions across space as you change the ICT price. And that's kind of one sort of model validation exercise we consider. And we do fairly well on that.
And Conor, is one of the industries ICT, and what's happening there? You didn't highlight it.
I didn't. I was trying to keep it kind of simple, but yeah, SSS is going to be particularly good at using ICT. ICT is going to be particularly productive in SSS, and the other industry not so much. So that's how we're going to get SSS adopting the ICT.
I mean, the production of ICT itself, is it in SSS?
No, so the production of ICT is just going to happen at the aggregate level, and you're going to transform the final good into ICT capital at some constant rate of substitution, and changing that rate of substitution is going to be what changes the price. So we're going to think about like just some exogenous technological improvement in the efficiency of ICT capital production that we think that, you know, just looks like Moore's law, and that's going to exogenously vary the ICT price in the aggregate.
But how about in the data? Was the ICT industry among the SSS?
Yes. So, I mean, there's a couple of things to say. Is information itself is not just that; it's also sort of the software industry. So people who use ICT very intensively. But I agree that there's some part of hardware production in ICT capital production that we're sort of just punting on. It's kind of hidden in the background. And we're just going to embed that at the aggregate level. But you might think as well that SSS becomes more productive itself because of technological improvements in ICT production. But that's sort of not here, I guess. So I guess what we should probably think about is breaking out information into those two components and saying, well, how much of the wage trends we think about are coming from the production of ICT versus the use of ICT. That's a great point. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, these different regional comparative advantages, they're going to lead to a cutoff essentially, where that cutoff, that the firm level efficiency above which you decide to adopt ICT capital is going to be lower in locations with a comparative advantage in SSS. Now, crucially, that's also going to give you faster productivity growth or unbalanced productivity growth in locations with initially higher productivity just from one aggregate change. And I'll show you how that works in a second, but let me just describe briefly kind of what else is in the model. Well, we're going to take very standard preferences for workers across both place and sectors. Given you've chosen to live in a place, you're going to just have kind of these standard Frichet draws of working in a sector at the sectoral level, given you've chosen to live in a place where your sectoral choice depends on the wage in the sector and potentially some sectoral amenity terms. And then spatial labor supply is going to look similar. You're going to just draw again. You're going to be maximizing over the expected wage. You're going to essentially draw your preference shock for locations first. And then once you get to the place, you're going to draw your preference for working in either sector. So you're going to be maximizing over this kind of, Frichet average wage, let's say. So just to illustrate how the main mechanism is kind of going to work, just first think of just one type of labor and one sector, and you can derive all kind of this analytically. So you'd get average productivity across firms in a location. If I just average over the Z's, it's going to consist of two components. So the first is going to be that fundamental efficiency draw, which is the same across space. And the second is going to be an endogenous component, which depends on the adoption decisions of ICT that differs across space. You're going to be integrating above the cutoff, where that cutoff differs across space, the extra component of efficiency that's coming from ICT capital adoption. So then changes in the price of ICT capital, that uniform price in the macro, is going to affect average productivity through essentially two channels. First, you're going to affect the inframarginal firms, the firms that are already above the cutoff and have decided to adopt ICT. They're going to adopt more ICT. And second, you're going to affect the marginal firm. You're going to lower the adoption cutoff as you change the price. So you can actually draw this all out analytically and think about these two separate effects, the direct effect just being the inframarginal firms and the indirect effect being the change in the cutoff. And basically what you're going to get is a uniform decline in P you can show is going to cause faster productivity growth in places that already had a high cutoff, which is a low cutoff, which is places that had a comparative advantage in SSS. And this is going to give you a source of spatially biased labor demand growth. So you're going to see labor demand, particularly for skilled workers, but in this one type model, only the one type of worker, grow faster in denser, richer locations. Cecilia, did you want to say something, or you're all good? Cool. So kind of how would that work in equilibrium? Well, if you think about the supply and demand for workers, just this one type of worker, say I've only got two locations, and I think about the supply curves for workers across these locations coming from these sectoral choices. And I think about the demand for workers coming from the firm side. You can think about, say, the blue location and the green location, the blue location having both a higher fundamental advantage for SSS production and also being a nicer place to live. So having in equilibrium a lower intercept on the labor supply curve. If you just think about the initial urban wage gradient as the locus of these two equilibrium points, what's going to happen if you have spatially biased labor demand growth? Well, you're going to get the labor demand curve in that second place, the one that's really productive, it's going to shift to the right, and you're going to get an increase in the slope of this locus between the 2 points, okay? Now, that's just for a two location, very simple example. You can show this quite generally. Basically, if the correlation between sort of the fundamental amenities of a place, how nice it is to work, and the initial productivity terms is positive, then growth is going to be urban bias. So basically what the interpretation of that is, larger places are going to need to be easier places to expand scale, larger places being nice places to live. And we can sort of test a version of this in the quantitative section, and we show kind of support for this condition. So I don't have that much time left, so maybe let me just briefly sketch what we do in the quantitative exercise. So like I said, we're going to treat the ICT price essentially as exogenous. We're just going to take it from the data and think of this as being the fundamental driving force in the economy. Think of it like Moore's law. There's just some fundamental exogenous technical progress going on in ICT capital production. And we're going to calibrate the model to the 1980 cross-section of US cities. And we're going to basically exactly match wages, quantities of high skill and low skill labor across space in 1980. And we're going to trace out the general equilibrium prediction across space of the model in response to this one uniform ICT price decline. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're basically going to, for a calibrated version of the model, when we take the fundamental parameters, we're going to saturate the model and recover these local comparative advantage terms, amenities, and sectoral amenities to exactly match that data in 1980. But to do that, we're going to need to be able to get these production parameters from somewhere. So we do a bunch of things. The important ones are essentially these non-homotheticity parameters and the substitution between high skill and low skill labor at the firm level. So to get these, we're basically going to calibrate the model to essentially a shift share regression that's valid in the world of the model if you think changes in those fundamental productivities are unrelated to their initial levels, essentially. So saying, well, what would the world look like if the only thing that was changing in a spatially biased way was just the endogenous component of investment decisions, and all the fundamentals were just changing in kind of random ways? So we'll get this from a shift share regression essentially, and that'll get us the non-homogeneous.
One question here. So this approach, if you had agglomeration, is this still valid under?
It's not. You can adjust this for agglomeration, but then you're going to need some other measure of the strength of agglomeration forces. So how, like the local comparative advantage terms, how they respond to changes just in the quantities of skilled labor across space. So if that was true, this regression that we do wouldn't be valid, but you would be able to adjust for it if you had some other source of variation that could identify the strength of agglomeration spillovers. But we don't have that, and we don't do that. And for labor supply elasticities, well, we'll estimate our own sectoral labor supply elasticities, and we'll take the spatial labor supply elasticities from the data. I mean, one thing you might think is kind of missing here, aren't we just like punting on house prices? Where are house prices in this? Well, I mean, as I guess many of us know, you can write a version of this with house prices that is isomorphic to what we've written down, and all that's going to change is the interpretation of the labor supply elasticity parameter across space. So if you take labor supply elasticity estimates from the data, I can always write a version of the model with house prices that'll give you the same movements in quantities of labor across space in response to changing investment decisions.
That's if the housing supply elasticity is common across all locations?
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly true. If you had heterogeneous housing supply elasticities, you wouldn't get that.
But I think a feature of the data would be the places that are at the top of the CZ distribution are places where it's pretty inelastic, and that's why it shows up so much in prices and not quantities.
That's true. I mean, again, you could get that, well, you could model that in this way without house prices just by having different labor supply elasticities to place, right?
Sure. Okay.
We haven't done that, but that's a good point. We probably should do that and see how the results change. So back to this new urban bias in the model. Well, this is both data, 1980 and 2015. Like I said, in the model, we're going to exactly match all commuting zones, the prices and quantities in 1980. So that 1980 line is both data and model. And then we're going to vary the ICT price from 1980 to 2015, the change that we see in the data. And this is essentially the urban bias you would get in the model just from this one aggregate price change. So you do pretty well in matching the overall steepening of the urban wage gradient. You get essentially no movement out of SSS. You get a little bit, there's some relative price changes going on at the sectoral level that kind of gives you a little bit of urban bias here, but really essentially none, because non-SSS is not adopting much ICT capital in this model. But yeah, in the data and in the model, you essentially recover most of the urban bias increase for SSS. You understate a little bit what's going on in these top cities. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One thing, kind of on Jonathan's point, we aren't fully able to generate the movement of skilled labor to New York and San Francisco just from this ICT price decline. And there's a bunch of reasons why that probably is. I mean, there's been some great papers thinking about endogenous amenities in response to movements in skilled workers across space. I mean, it's probably true that New York and San Francisco got a lot nicer since 1980. I mean, both in terms of crime and you know, the kind of restaurants and all the things that are available there. And part of that is contributing to why we don't fully match the increase in the average wage gradient across space. We don't get fully enough movement of skilled workers into these top density deciles, but we get a fair bit essentially. And you can
Corona might help you bring it down to the model, the data to the model.
Say that again, Cecilia.
Corona will help you bring the data down to the.
Maybe that's going to reverse a lot of this. Yeah, I mean, essentially we wrote the paper the day before Corona started, essentially. All right, sectorally, I mean, the ICT price decline gets you the aggregate movements in the college and non-college worker ratio across sectors, but you can kind of see here what's going on across space. Like I was saying, you don't get the full increase in the non-college worker ratio in the top density decile bins, but you get it pretty much right just from these aggregate movements in ICT. So I think the model kind of does well there. So yeah, there's a bunch more stuff in the paper that I didn't really get time to today, but maybe I'll leave a little bit of time for some chat. So the model essentially we think of as a unified explanation for the new urban bias. It successfully generates urban bias wage growth just from one macro change and replicates the labor supply responses fairly well in the aggregate and across regions. Falls short in the kind of the largest cities, and I kind of discuss what we think might be going on there. I mean, to conclude, I mean, just to set this paper in context, that at least for most of history, if you think about the era of manufacturing, there was broadly one of widely shared growth where, you know, both skill types and many regions benefited somewhat broadly from productivity growth. This SSS-led economic growth that we're seeing now or in recent decades just looks kind of fundamentally different. It looks like some superstar regions and workers are seeing rapid wage growth in these particular sectors, and it's not being shared across space. And the flip side is, you know, smaller places and less skilled workers really don't seem to be benefiting that much from these technological changes. And it's a kind of an open question with Corona and with everything that's going on where this is eventually going to lead us. But I'd love to take any questions in these last couple of minutes if you have any.
I'll bite, which is, I don't think this is actually the right alternative hypothesis, but I'd be interested in sort of understanding which pieces of your model help distinguish between different stories. So suppose I believed in the superstar cities like Yorko, Mayer, Sinai story, where it's all about the combination of heterogeneous housing supplies. So like one city is very inelastic housing supply and the other is very elastic, and then just top income growth. So everybody's got these idiosyncratic preferences, and then it was the SSS, the finance guys got richer in the national income distribution, but then, so what moments that you showed me would that story hit, and then what moments would it miss so that I need to believe your thing instead of something that's all about housing supply?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, like hidden in what you said, it is a production story, essentially interacting with some static housing supply. Like there has to be a reason for top income growth in SSS and not outside SSS that has to be driving this. It can't just be that housing supply elasticity got tighter in dense cities and nothing was going on in the production side, because then we should see, you know, sectors acting somewhat similarly in response to changing housing supplies when you control for their skill compositions.
I mean, Yorko, Mayer, Sinai didn't have sectors, so I'm trying to shove it in there. But basically, if you take the income distribution and say the people high in the income are working in SSS, and then other sectors are, you know, different parts of the income distribution, wouldn't I get something of that flavor where hold the elasticities constant? There's this cross section of San Francisco's always been hard to build, but then like you anoint some winners that suddenly have much higher incomes and therefore higher willingness to pay for their preferred spot. They move to San Francisco, and you know, you get the wage growth, but they're tagged as SSS people. So you see wage growth for those people, but it's really just they're indulging their preferences in the kind of Yorko et al. Story.
Fair. I think there's two different things going on there. Like if this was purely a preference story and say like skilled workers started loving cities more, you should see the kind of the opposite thing, actually. You should see wages fall, particularly for the top income earners in SSS in New York. But yeah, again, like there's some reason why the top income earners in SSS are seeing wage growth, right? And you know, we're thinking about a reason why that is. Maybe we don't have the exact right reason, but I think it's pretty good. Part of this as well, changing housing supply elasticities, like I was saying before, you know, yeah, that kind of gives you some counterfactual predictions across industries if everyone has the same sort of exposure to housing supply elasticities. But I agree, if you, some elements of it are there, but if you distinguish different parts of the story, I think you get kind of what we're saying, that it can't be preferences alone, it can't be housing supply elasticity alone. Something has to be happening on the production side, and it has to be happening in these four nice two-digit sectors. So that's how I explain it.
So I think putting those pieces together, I mean, at least for people very inside this literature, putting those pieces of evidence together to help you distinguish between competing hypotheses is really helpful.
Okay,
Thanks.
good. No, that's a great comment. I think we need to do a bit more of that in the paper.
I'll follow up on that. So the ICT story is a global one. So I was chatting with Fabian about this. To what extent is this steepening wage density gradient a global one? And can you sort of compare, like, using variation across countries, the amount that this is steepening with the fall in ICT?
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that question. And we're trying, like right now, we're kind of trying to see if the same story holds in Europe. The thing is, you have to kind of stitch together different data sets in Europe, and we're having a little bit of trouble doing that. But I agree, like that would be, if we show that, that's an additional validation of our story, that, you know, you're exactly right. If I don't know essentially whether the urban wage gradient in Europe has steepened, but I would like to know that. So if anyone can point me in any papers or any data sources in that direction, I would love to know that.
Yeah, I should just say to that, we did have a little bit of a look at Europe, and you know, as Conor says, the data is really hard to reconcile across countries because these NUTS regions are really differently sized across countries, and the data availability is a little bit different. We have some preliminary evidence that you see the same thing in Europe. There's also a recent paper by Lisa Giannone, who I think is in the chat too, who, you know, on divergence across regions, across countries in the world. And I think she also finds that countries that are transitioning into services see, you know, regional divergence. So we see that as a follow-up work, or like very much in line with our story here for the United States.
Okay.
I have a question about what makes something a service. I mean, relative to Fabian's other work, here, a service, this doesn't have to be a service. This is, you know, traded costlessly, just like everything else. There's nothing special about services. You're just putting a label on this.
Yeah, you're right. I'm putting a label on it, and I'm saying these skilled services are things that are particularly productive in users of ICT. But you're right, there's nothing that makes the service special beyond that in this paper, I think. As in, yeah, there's nothing about tradability being more difficult or less difficult than goods here, as in Fabian's work. We're just labeling this as kind of different production technologies.
Yeah, I think it's, in some sense, this is very intentional because, you know the Violante Grossel-Ohanian paper where they explain the rise in the aggregate college wage premium through a decline in ICT prices effectively. And in some sense, we wanted to see, can we amend this macro story with regions and use exactly the same shock and not talk about, you know, specificities of sectors, so to say, and kind of explain this additional element of faster, you know, urban wage premium growth in addition to faster skilled wage premium growth, somehow casting both of these as a kind of features of unequal growth that seem to be associated with the decline in ICT prices.
Sorry, on this, just kind of to iterate on Dorian's comment, it seems like there's something that shifts the labor demand across regions differentially.
Right.
And it's kind of two explanations, like Dorian said another explanation. There's one explanation about ICT, but is this kind of a fair description of what's going on here?
It is. We're modeling differential labor demand shifts through global changes in the prices of ICT.
And then maybe kind of following up how, and maybe Jonathan's question too, okay, so you're backing up this from the data, but how could you distinguish from other explanations that could be, or maybe it's kind of a universal approach where you say, okay, maybe they would all look similar to something like we did with the universal gravity things. So they look all like labor demand shocks, but here there's a labor demand shock that's differential across regions.
You're right. I mean, you're right in one sense that, like, it has to be a labor demand shock and it has to be biased towards SSS. The ICT element we think is very natural, but we can't rule out other things going on, maybe tradability, like in Fabian's paper. But yeah, whatever your story has to be, it has to come from these biased labor demand shocks, we think, to match the data.
Well, maybe then you could just display it in that way. To say, here's a way that we explain many of these, we incorporate many of these explanations, and you can choose your own. But
In some sense, what we like about the graphs that Conor showed is that any explanation has to be, has to feature this urban bias, and it has to feature the sector bias. And there's a lot of explanation that kind of hit one of the two, but to get both of them at the same time is kind of hard, right? For example, anything that's specific to high-skilled workers won't work because we don't see the same wage growth patterns for doctors across space, right? And so it can't be skill-specific only. So somehow working with these, between these two graphs, there's actually quite a small set of explanations that works for both.
Yeah, I push back on that a little bit in the sense of the doctors aren't traded, right? So I guess, so like in my AER with Don Davis, we did this exercise where you have neutral, like the value of skilled people interacting goes up in a neutral way, but then it's obviously not spatially neutral because, bigger cities are better at that. And I guess we had all of the skilled people working in the tradable sector. And then that wouldn't work if doctors are, producing a non-tradable, that would kind of be shut down. So I think that I sort of agree with the spirit of Costas's comment about try to be as general as possible about what generates the neutral labor demand shift that has spatially uneven consequences.
Right.
But tradability then is really, that adds a piece that you want to, that's why you used, what's it called? Now you have it scalable skilled services. Wasn't tradability in the name at STS? Wasn't that the acronym like 2 years ago?
It was.
I think the tradability is kind of important. And that's the thing about the doctors is they're not tradable.
Yeah.
They are now. Do you have a measure of kind of how far the services in these industries travel? And whether that's even further than it was before?
I mean, well, I'll let Fabian speak to it, but I think the thing you're kind of hampered with is like within US trade flow data on services is kind of hard. So we just saw a paper where we saw, trade in IT was going across the world, right? And so right. Externally, you get this before. I mean, exports of ICT services and these SSS services has gone up massively. But just thinking about the tradability within the US is kind of, you run into this data problem, I think.
Is that right? I mean, like banking services and finance services, there's got to be a way of kind of measuring how that, like Fidelity is able to kind of expand everywhere. You don't have a way of doing that?
I mean, you can do it in a model, which is what Fabian does. It's just having the direct flows of Fidelity across space. I'm not aware of it, but yeah.
No, there's to my knowledge for the US, there's no data on service trade flows, not even in any subsector of the service industry. There's some surveys on the utilization of banking services. Where do you get your banking from? This kind of stuff, but that's it. There's not more.
I mean, in some sense, we know these things have to be trading. Going back to the concentration ratios we started with almost two and a half hours ago, if these industries are becoming more concentrated and people are not becoming a lot more concentrated, then it has to be that these things are kind of traveling further in some sense. So
right. But
I think that's what the ICT does, right? Like I have a bank on my computer now, right?
So that was exactly the idea in my job market paper. It's to kind of compare the spatial concentration of producers versus demand. And you see that, drifting apart in space, which kind of implies that they must be more traded, but you don't see these trade flows in any data set that I'm aware of. I think in Canada, we have some regional trade data, although probably much of it is made up. But if there you see it a little bit, but there's no great data that I'm aware of. Maybe these firm-to-firm, VAT data sets could actually help with this.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you very much for all the comments. Super helpful.
Good. So it was interesting. We said everyone had an hour, but everyone, when we adjusted the start times, no one adjusted their finish times. So we ended up right on time in the end. So we were just going to leave it open as we always do in case people wanted to chat. But we had 3 really great papers that kind of look at IT in different ways with, and it was a nice group of papers. So thanks to all the presenters, and we'll just kind of call it quits, but we can kind of leave the stream open. Okay.
But I agree on the assessment of the papers. A really nice conference. Thank you to the organizers also.
No, thanks to the participants too.
Yep, I think on behalf of the presenters, I should also thank the organizers. This was a really great session for us to see all the papers together and also get the feedback that we got.
Great.
I have a last question for the first and the third paper. Sorry, I had to leave in the second. But so the production function you both use basically has a shifter that depends on the technology. It's like a productivity shifter, but depends on the scale, right?
Exactly.
And that's true also for Conor, right? Is this?
Yeah, I mean, the relative skill productivities depend on the scale.
But okay, but then you had two. Sorry, this is kind of geeky, but like you had two Ys. You, Conor, had two Ys, and Daniel had one Y. But I guess it's the same, right? You just kind of divide by the.
Like taking the one term, factoring one term, and taking it out of the.
Right. Okay. But okay. So the principle is like as you change the scale. But then I guess you, Daniel, you applied it across firms. And they applied it, and then Conor and co-authors applied it across space, I guess. Sorry, Daniel and co-authors. Sorry, I didn't notice where I didn't exactly. Daniel and co-authors applied it across firms, and then you, Conor and co-authors applied it across space.
And space.
So we used it for IT versus non-IT, whereas Conor and
Right. There are two factors, and then thanks for the clarification. But if you had more factors, and then you could just apply it to more factors, right? I mean, this kind of the logic applies to more factors.
You can, for each factor, you can add one extra elasticity, output elasticity. Essentially, of course, you can do it the number of factors minus one, number of parameters in total.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
I had a follow-on question to Kostas. I'm sorry I had to join late. I only caught Conor's. Going back to that production function, aren't there implications? I raised the issue before about whether you'd want to put the location output rather than the firm output in there, and maybe it doesn't make much difference in terms of the aggregates. You needed an assumption, I think, about the thetas and the alphas being correlated to get you there. I was just wondering if you needed that, if you put in agglomeration effects. But also, going your way, aren't there implications for firm size? And maybe you touched on that at the beginning, but I didn't. Do you have any data on firm size, and wouldn't that discipline?
We do, and we think of it as sort of an out of model or out of sample validation. I mean, what you're going to see is the average firm size increases most in SSS in the largest cities, and that seems to be somewhat true in the data. So we can compare that directly to the model.
Yeah, it'd be nice to.
You don't quite do it, but the pattern is there, I think.
Yeah, it'd be nice.
It would be great to show that, to put it in the slides,
But there are no firms. Are there firms in your model though?
Yeah, they're heterogeneous firms, and they're different.
Okay, no, police competition. I've missed that.
Yeah, so another data issue is you have the firms in this style of model popping up or disappearing in the locations. So you don't have a firm location choice like some of these models do.
Not in the sense that firms comparing locations. We have an entry margin in which, like, as profitability goes up in these densest locations, you can get more firms in these locations.
Right. But it would be interesting to see if there are any data that informed us about whether these firms are just local apparitions.
Yeah.
Or I think Doran had a paper a few weeks ago where the firm choice was an issue, and I don't know the extent to which this movement to the big cities is the decline of firms in the small ones and the growth and entry of firms in the big ones. And it seems your model has implications for that, and it would be interesting.
I mean, it does on the establishment level, but we didn't model, like Dorian was saying, a span of control problem where you're putting establishments in different places. I would love to. It's hard, it's challenging, but I think it's a nice thing to think about.
I just have two remaining questions, which are for both the second paper and the third paper. I kind of maybe a bit fluffy, but in terms of welfare, so for the second paper, I was kind of a bit fuzzy on, whether there might, the probability of emigrating to the US is sort of small, so maybe the impacts are small. And could we think about there being some probability of emigrating to the US which maximizes welfare for India, given the mechanisms that you have?
Are you thinking more like something like a planner's problem? I think that the way we were thinking about it in the paper is more, the cap is completely exogenous to whatever happens in India. It's determined by the US, by political factors. But I think you could think there's a point in which whatever gains India is getting from the spillover will get netted just by the fact that wages are starting to go up because it's need to demand more labor. So it's definitely not just like completely increasing forever. Like, I mean, I don't know, we couldn't have something like a gigantic probability of migration. So it's probably like a point in with the probability. Yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting exercise, I think, to the planner's problem and find that. We haven't done that yet, but.
Because it just seems kind of surprising on an intuitive level that this small probability, I mean, okay, it's not a trivial probability, but, small probability could have like a really big, what's the externality there, that there could be a really big impact on India from just giving people this small option to migrate to the US. That seems kind of surprising that would have a big impact.
In reality, I think you generally see it whenever, for example, there was talks, like the first visit of the Indian Prime Minister with Trump. Part of the talks they were doing was like making sure that immigration wasn't going to be stopped. And, like immigration was such a big deal because in India, in fact, they know that immigration to the US is actually very beneficial for them. The reason it's restricted is more just because of US decisions that immigration is very restricted. But I think if it would be up to India, they would definitely expand that.
No, for sure. But just in terms of what are the mechanisms in the model that this flow, which is a small number of people given the size of India, would have a non-trivial impact.
I think the main thing is in the model is that spillover term where computer scientists expand the productivity of IT.
And I was kind of wondering what's disciplining that and what happens when you shut that down to your welfare measures, because that seems to be sort of key for this thing. And that was the part that I was kind of like a little bit.
Yeah, so we estimate that parameter of the spillover using patents and a shock to labor supply in order to estimate it. But our estimate is consistent with other estimates in the literature in terms of spillover of computer scientists in technology. So what we show is that if you completely shut down the spillover, actually India loses from this immigration because people are getting into computer science, but it's not a particular productivity driven from computer science. So actually they're just getting, they lose college graduates and they're getting more of a skill that they don't necessarily need. But as long as you have like a small spillover, we try with different magnitudes of the spillover as robustness. As long as you even have like a small spillover, it already generates this brain gain that we talk about in the model. So even if you use a spillover below whatever we're estimating, it's already enough to create this gain of acquiring skills of computer science.
Then I wanted to ask to Conor.
Dorian, can I just follow up on that for a second? Are you appropriately accounting for like the costs of accumulating that technology? I mean, I think that's sort of the surprising thing to me. In the sense that these guys are all taking a draw for the lottery to win, but the guys who are left, they just paid for it and they didn't actually get it. So I would have thought that, if you properly account for the resources they gave up to sort of shift into like this other field where they took a loss, And maybe this is what you were saying about the externality, but
I mean, in our welfare calculations, that's part of what we're doing. Like when we calculate the welfare, it's actually people that are switching. I mean, they get some penalty on the wage, but they also get a penalty in terms of utility. They need to pay a fixed cost in order to switch occupations and all that, and that's accounted for in our welfare calculations. So
it's really just, you shift with like a different policy, and then you're starting measuring things right from when the shift happens, and so really it's you're accounting for all the costs that are going.
Yeah, in some sense, the spillover generated by computer scientists is enough to compensate for the costs that are born of workers that lose the lottery and stay. Like,
okay, all right, thanks. Sorry, Dorian.
No, it's okay. So then to Conor, I just wanted to ask, there's kind of literature on place-based policies in models where there's agglomeration, and since you don't have the agglomeration, is that everything's efficient and
Everything's efficient. There's no need to do anything about place-based policies in this world, at least.
That's a pity for policymakers. They don't have a job.
I mean, exactly. Everyone's always asking, what is this? Where's the place-based policy? And sometimes there is none.
Yeah. Good. All right. Anyone else? No?